Okay. So one of the most interesting things that he gave in his readings was a much broader history of the world and of our history. How many of you maybe remember when you were in school you got the lecture that the cradle of civilization was what? Mesopotamia? In 4000 BC. And if you've been attending these conferences for very long, that makes that old piece of information pretty laughable, doesn't it? And of course we know that even mainstream archaeology now has gone way past 4000 BC. But according to Edgar Cayce and other wisdom traditions and other psychic material, we know that there was really history that goes much further back. In the Cayce story, he tells us that the first root race, as he calls it, and this is very similar to the idea that comes out of Blavatsky and those guys, we were really ethereal spiritual beings in about 12 million BC. There was a second root race in Lemuria about 10 million BC. The third root race is the one we're going to be concerned about. And he said actually Atlantis had residents as early as 200,000 BC. Now there's nothing in mainstream archaeology that follows that. But he says that they met their demise around 10,000 BC, which is around the same time Plato identifies their final destruction. And that's really what we've keyed in on our research. He also says sometime maybe 12,000 BC, maybe 20,000 BC, there's a lot of question in the readings, that there was a fourth root race, that there was some other genetic change in humankind, and that we are actually in a period now where we may be moving into a fifth root race. All right, just a little background. This is very much just a thumbnail sketch of Edgar Cayce's story. It's a huge story. Someone sent me this cartoon. I thought, well, at least the mainstream is keeping up with the idea of Atlantis. So your flood control bill didn't make it out of the committee? Well, it's not the end of the world. Or is it? So let's talk about Cayce's story of the destruction of Atlantis. He said there were 3 destructions. One of them, he said, occurred in about 50,000 BC. There were about 21 readings that reference this. And he said that in 50,000 BC there were a lot of large animals, and there was an effort to try to annihilate them, to get rid of them. And in the process of that, they created some sort of an explosion or some sort of environmental upheaval that created a pole shift. Now, Atlantis was still existed. Instead of being one continent, it became 5 islands at that point. In 28,000 BC, and there were 52 readings that related to this time frame, he said somebody was in charge of this power tool that they called the Firestone. Some people think it was a quartz crystal of some sort, but he doesn't really describe it in enough detail for us to know exactly what it was. But some people believe it was something like a laser, that it may have been used in a similar way, because he talked about it being used for surgery. He talked about it being used to power submarines, airplanes, really quite a technology. But in 20,000 BC, somebody got in there and tuned it up too high, and it created another destruction for Atlantis. But the one we're most concerned about in our explorations is the 10,000 BC destruction. And that's where you get most of the Edgar Cayce readings. There were 352 readings that talked about some sort of catastrophe that happened in 10,000 BC. And we don't know what it was. We don't know if it was a comet, a tsunami, whether it was global warming or an earthquake. If you were watching the Indonesia tsunami, in 2004, you realize how destructive that kind of a force is, that it could just about wiped out all sign of civilization. But what we know from the Cayce readings is that there was some kind of warning. Whatever this thing was, they knew it was about to happen. And they knew it, so they decided that in order to maintain a record of their civilization, that they would create these 3 halls of records. And we're going to talk about those. And these halls of records, what are in those records? Well, they wanted to, first of all, preserve their history. And in the readings it says that in these halls of records are tablets, and that there'll be 32 of these tablets or plates that are found. They also talk about that it's going to be a little bit difficult to tell what those tablets say. They're going to be in Egyptian, early Egyptian, but they're also going to have some Atlantean language in them. So it's going to take a little while for us to translate and know what they mean. So what kinds of things are in the hall or in the place where the records are? Well, it's not just the tablets. It's also, information about pyramid building, the firestone. There'll be information about how it was constructed and what it was. There'll be musical instruments, linens, ancient tools, things about lost arts, and so forth. Even some unleavened bread, supposedly. I'm sure that'll be delicious by that time. But then, of course, what everybody wants to know is, when will the records be found? What did Edgar Cayce have to say about that? Well, he seems to indicate that it's a time when there's some sort of change that occurs in the earth. And a lot of people read these readings back in the 60s and 70s and actually created communes and went and sort of did all their survival work, and were ready between 58 and 98 for some major change to happen where there'd be some kind of catastrophe, and of course it didn't happen. However, we do know that global warming is, at least some of us believe that there's such a thing as global warming, and that those are earth changes that he's talking about here. Upheavals, shifting of the poles. We know that we're having a great melting at the poles. We do know that the climate is changing in a lot of ways. So one of the things that you hear in the Cayce readings is that the future is not set. So even though he made this prediction, it doesn't mean that these particular dates are going to be accurate. He says that we have the ability to make a change through our own choices as to what's going to happen in the future. So it looks like he was just a little bit off. We're probably in this period now, or at least the beginnings of it. So he also says that it won't be entered until the time has been fulfilled, that the changes must be active. He says that they may also not be entered until there's an understanding and until the fifth root race begins. Well, when you look in the Cayce material for what the heck is the fifth root race, what he tells you is that it's, rather than so much a physical change among human beings, it's a consciousness change. And if you look at just what's happening with technology, for example, consciousness is changing. We were just talking about the other day how short our attention span has become, how much information we have to take in every day, and how much we multitask, and we're getting lots of bits of information from so many sources. Things seem to be moving faster and faster and faster. And some people believe that may be a sign of the fifth root race, that it's actually a change in consciousness, maybe a change in our neuroscience or neurology. Okay, but then the third thing he says is that the records will be opened when there is a seeking within the inner self for a knowledge of the close relationships with the creative forces. In other words, when we're doing that spiritual search, when people all over the world are doing more of a spiritual search. And I think I see that around the world too at the moment. We see really terrible things around the world, but you also see people who truly are seekers for their connection with that deeper self and with that divine self. So back again to the circle. So the fifth root race, one more time, is that consciousness shift. All right. So it's very possible we're in the era when the Hall of Records is going to be found. So where is the Hall of Records? Where are the Hall of Records? Well, he said they were put in 3 different places. One is in the Yucatan, and one is in the Bahamas and Bimini, and that's where we've spent a lot of time. We have been to the area of Piedras Negras in Guatemala, where he seems to give clues that that's where he put one of the Hall of Records, or where they put one of the Hall of Records. And there's also one in Egypt. And there's been a lot of work by the ARE, by the Edgar Cayce organization, to try to find the one in Egypt. And at the end of this talk, I'm going to tell you the latest in that direction. But let's start with the Yucatan, and I'm going to give you, again, just really a thumbnail on this one, because the talk is really going to be about the Bahamas. What he said is that the records were in the Aryan or Yucatan land where the temple there is overshadowing same. It's a long way for an awful lot of stone. And one of the things we realized is that with this type of stone, a stone the size of the refrigerator is multi-tons. So if you're carrying that kind of a load over to the Bahamas, you're carrying it over for a really important reason. Now, this gives you an idea. Here's Brown's Ruins over here. Here's Jamaica. Here's Hispaniola. That's even a long distance to be carrying it. But it's not likely it came from those sources. So we talked to a professor of geology in Miami. He said, the blocks seem large. And he says they do seem to be quarried for a particular purpose. Most intriguing. And he goes on to say that yeah, they only occur in Jamaica, maybe Hispaniola, but not likely. He says maybe the Appalachians or France or Spain, but he said there's not a lot of it around in the Caribbean islands. Somebody's brought it in. He said, my original thought is that maybe those stones were used for ballast. But then he realized they were a little bit large for that, right? And his final statement is, sorry, I'm stumped. He has no idea why it's there. So we wanted to know, well, how is schist usually used? Well, guess what it's used for? Buildings. They used it in Central Park in a building. They used it as long ago as 5 to 17,000 or 1700 BC in Portugal. It was used in Greece, the ancient Temple of Pelion. They've found it in use as far back as 10,000 BC by the Neolithics in Norway. They found it in Egypt. It was a common stone to use to make objects. This mysterious object that we found as we were looking for things was the schist disc. You really have to say that carefully. Was discovered in Saqqara. No, they really don't know what it is, but they call it an incense burner. Looks kind of UFO-y, doesn't it? So the question is, when and how did these stones get here? Was it cargo from a shipwreck? So maybe it wasn't ballast, but maybe it was cargo. All right, well, that's a long way to come. See if we can get any dates. All right, so remember there were 3 places that Edgar Cayce said the Hall of Records were placed. One was the Yucatan, one was the Bahamas, and the third one was Egypt. And so you're probably familiar through Baval's work and Hancock's work about what ARE has done through the years, what the Edgar Cayce organization has done looking for the Hall of Records really since the 50s. Edgar Cayce's son, Hugh Lynn, was very interested in this, and he's the one who really formed a relationship with Zahi Hawass back in those days, helped him get through school, and Mark Lehner was a member of ARE for many, many years. The Egyptian Hall of Records, according to the Cayce readings, he gives you some pretty specific stuff. He says it's from the chambers of the way between the Sphinx, so the Sphinx is a real important piece of this, and the Pyramid of Records. The Pyramid of Records, we think, is a pyramid that may be underground somewhere that holds the Hall of Records. And this is just a look at the whole Giza Plateau. He says, for the later pyramids are those yet not uncovered that have been spoken of between the Sphinx, or the mystery, he calls the Sphinx the mystery, and the Nile, or the river. So the Nile used to run, here's the Sphinx, the Nile used to run where you see all of this city over here. It's now further east. But this is the Sphinx, this is the Great Pyramid, this is the Second Pyramid, and so the river used to run through here, and he talks about the Sphinx right paw, which would be over on this side. This would be a side of interest. So in this position, as the sun rises, let's see, which may not be entered, he's talking about the Hall of Records, from the connecting chambers from the Sphinx paw, the right paw, until the time has been fulfilled. Well, maybe it has been fulfilled, maybe it hasn't. We've been wondering if it has not been fulfilled because we found that the doors were shutting in all 3 places. If you know very much about what's going on in Guatemala, you know their government is pretty much falling apart. It was already a pretty dangerous area when we went in 2004. And we could see on the Usumacinta River every day, 2 or 3 times a day, you'd see a boatload of people go by with backpacks. And, we were assuming they were primarily immigrants coming up to the United States. Well, now we know that there were also, and continues to be, a lot of drug movement along that river and then up through Mexico and into the United States. And as the government is losing control, it's become an even more difficult area to enter. The Bahamas, which I didn't mention, the reason we have not done any further research on Brown's ruins is shortly after we stopped, or shortly after we found the Brown's ruins, we called our friend who was an archaeologist who had been going with us on some of our expeditions when we needed a permit, and said, we need you to come with us. We found this incredible site. And he said, okay, let me just renew my archaeological permit. And he goes to do the renewal, and time goes by and time goes by, and finally he finds out that they put a moratorium on all the permits. Everybody's permit is suspended. He's had one for 25 years. So we go in a little bit deeper and we find out that there was there was a group that had come in and found a shipwreck. And they'd had their permit, but when they when they found something, they took it back and they didn't give the portion to the Bahamas that they were supposed to give. Well, when we first started looking in the Bahamas, we were accused of looking for gold. We would tell people we were looking for Atlantis, and they'd say, yeah, right. What are you really looking for? And we would have to say, no, we're really looking. Have you heard of Edgar Cayce? And go through the whole story, and they'd still just kind of shake their head, because there were a lot of people who would go and find these shipwrecks that we did find evidence of, and never tell the Bahamian government what they were doing. So apparently somebody got caught, and that put a stop to everything, and they redid all of their regulations, and now their regulations are so tight. It's amazing. I think you have to get a permit for about a 1 mile square area, and you have to tell them in advance. You have to get permission to go to that particular area, where we used to go globally and, check the whole Great Bahama Bank. That wouldn't work anymore. You have to have an underwater Bahamian archaeologist. Well, there's very few underwater archaeologists, period, and there's only one Bahamian underwater archaeologist that we're aware of. You have to have a regular archaeologist, and so on and so forth, so that it's really ponderous to do any kind of archaeological exploration. So it's going to take a bigger group than we are to do it. So Egypt. So things are perking along in Egypt. And in fact, it was perking along partly because of Andrew Collins and because of Nigel. Their work with the Cygnus mystery, and that Deneb marked the entrance to a cave, the entrance to the Tomb of the Birds, and that there is a cave system that runs really all across from the Tomb of the Birds all the way over to the Sphinx, to the exact area that Edgar Cayce talked about that contained the Hall of Records. And about the time that was really getting going, and here's a picture of Andrew. You've probably seen this through the years. I love this picture. This is Andrew. This tells you this is the great, right after you go through the tomb into the first large entrance, and then you go down through here into the really, really tricky areas where all the bat and the guano is, and the really dangerous area. But it tells you there's an incredible underground system there in Giza. About the time this got going, of course, Zahi was not willing to admit that it even existed for a while, but Nigel and Andrew were persistent with it. But then we had the Egypt Spring and the uprising and the change in the government. And the next government that took over really did not want to do any kind of excavations. Then they got rid of Zahi. Zahi got in trouble because he was so close to Mubarak. You all are probably more familiar with all of that than I am, and it just seemed like that Egypt was shut down. So here's the third Hall of Records. And so our thinking at the Edgar Cayce organization was that, okay, the time is not right. The world's not ready for the information. So the most recent thing that's happened, though, is that now that there's a military government, they realize that these discoveries were part of what was bringing in a lot of the tourist the tours and the tourists into Egypt. So they have seen the light that they need to allow more excavations to go on, and if for no other reason but to bring in more income. So even though they really want to focus mostly on Muslim and Islamic archaeology, they are willing for a consortium to get together, and there's a company called Scan Pyramids that was commissioned in 2015 to actually do what I call an X-ray of the Great Pyramid, and it involves 3 universities from Canada, Japan, and France, and they're actually using 3 different types of non-invasive. So they're not doing any drilling, they're not doing anything that's going to harm the monuments, but they're doing thermography, 3D simulation, and muon radiography imaging, so like an X-ray. And what they found is pretty exciting. They found 2 new caverns, 2 new anomalies. One on the east side, which is here. If you remember, the Sphinx is over in this direction, and one on the north side where the entrance is. So the first hot spot they found was on the east wall. It's down at the bottom, and it's kind of off almost toward the north side. This is what it looks like without the thermography on it. But this is what the hot spot looks like. And they believe there's some kind of cavern and maybe passageway through there. There's Zahi standing next to it. Now, what's Zahi got to do with it? Well, he's no longer, of course, the director of the Giza Plateau, but they have asked him to come and be a part of this particular expedition, even though he's not over it, but he's sort of the public face of it, because they realize he has so many people who know who he is, and he knows how to get people excited about new discoveries, and they know that they need to bring people's interest back to Egypt to get people to come. So he's there in the picture, and also Mark Lehner, who was his assistant, has also been brought into this project. But it's really being done by Scan Pyramids. All right, then the north side, and this is the ancient original entrance. This is not the one that tourists go through. There's a better picture here. So this is the original ancient entrance, and this is the one that we go through as tourists. And you can see, this really gives you an idea, if you haven't been there, what a large monument this is. And the interesting thing, and I've got this information from John Van Auken, who is an ARE director at ARE, and he also oversees our connection to Egypt. And he's been in touch with Zahi and has a good relationship with him, so he's getting this information. But the glyph that's at the top of the ancient entrance symbolizes horizon of heaven, which is interesting. It may also have something to do with an entrance to the Hall of Records, maybe. But there's a possible open space up there around where that glyph is, and this is what it looks like on the thermography. So what they think is that there's a possible hidden passage right above that ancient entrance where that glyph is, and then they think this could be a chamber down here on the east side, and it would be under that ancient entrance. So the next step, and this is the great news, is they've Scan Pyramids has had their contract extended for a whole year, so that they can go internally into the Great Pyramid and see if they can map where these openings go and what they lead to. Now again, this isn't the underground caverns that Andrew discovered, Andrew and Nigel, but this is a start. This is finding something in the Great Pyramid that has not been found before. So it's really exciting, and it's exciting that they're allowing this to go on. And to me, it's exciting that these are mainstream people doing it, because that gives it a whole lot more credibility. I've always said that if Greg and I ever really found anything other, and we feel like we have with Brown's Ruins in the Bahamas, we hope that mainstream people will take up the charge, because those are the people who are going to be better believed than we would. All right, so One other thing, I asked John Van Auken the question, I said, well, what about the cave, the Tomb of the Birds and the cave that goes under Giza? Does he think that Zahi will ever go back to that? And his answer was that he asked the question, and they are interested, and they do plan to do something. But they say it'll probably be another year before they can take that step. So it may be that everything's going to open back up in Egypt. And so I see that there are tours planned to Egypt by some of the guys here. And I would say support that if you feel that it's safe enough for you to be there, because that's going to bring all of this back alive again. If they can see they can get our interest, they'll continue to do this kind of research. Now, John wanted to point out in these are his slides that I'm using here, that this same type of radiography was used to find Nefertiti's tomb inside Tut's tomb. Some of you may be familiar with this, that they've realized that there's more there than just Tut's tomb. Amazing that it's taken this long to find. And they think it may be the tomb of Nefertiti. And you see it's attached to the sides. And what that gives you, though, is hope that possibly in the Great Pyramid there's more there than meets the eye. The chambers and shafts that we're all familiar with are probably not all that's in that particular site. And you realize how large that monument is. Who knows what else is inside? And does it go to to one of the Hall of Records? It's certainly possible. All right, so if you have any interest in finding out more, I've given you really a thumbnail sketch of all of these things. You could probably, your best bet is down here, Atlantis in the Caribbean, which is one of Andrew Collins's many wonderful books, Cygnus Mystery, and Beneath the Pyramids. All of these relate to the Hall of Records. Greg and I have a book with John Van Auken on Edgar Cayce's Atlantis that goes into a whole lot more detail. There's some Edgar Cayce's Story of the Soul, which gives you a really panoramic view of history that's different from what the mainstream gives us. Edgar Evans Cayce, one of the sons of Edgar Cayce, wrote a book really many years ago, Edgar Cayce on Atlantis, and then he updated it about 10 years ago. And then there's a whole series of Edgar Cayce readings just on Atlantis. And then if you want to know more, we post where we are and what we've been doing on AP Magazine info, or you can go to edgarcayce.org, and John Van Auken will keep you up to date on what's going on with the Egypt investigations. All right, these are the transcripts actually of the readings in Virginia Beach. All right, so today we're going to go over the Atlantean Halls of Records. I'm going to give you an overview of the Atlantis research in the 3 locations: the Yucatan, Egypt, and the Bahamas. Okay, Edgar Cayce's Story of the Hall of Records, of course, begins with where is Atlantis? We did that last night. And, of course, Cayce tells us that Atlantis was in the Bahamas. He makes no bones about it. He says it was near Bimini off the coast of Florida. That's pretty specific. And there is a set of records that was hidden there. Of course, he says it's under the slime of the ages of seawater. And if you know very much about what happens to buildings and stone after they've been under seawater for a long period of time, they get pretty gooey and they get pretty covered with coral. And so that's probably a really good description of what has happened to Atlantis. But he does tell us that we may be able to find it. Just one more time, for those of you who either were not here last night or I went too fast last night, and I don't see the little pointer thing. Oh, there it is right in front of me. Okay, everything that you see here that's brown is above the water. This is Florida. This is Cuba. This is the largest island of the Bahamas called Andros. We spent quite a bit of time there. And then little bitty Bimini is right here on the edge where the ancient shoreline would have been in 10,000 BC, and it's still got a portion of it above water. So all of this light blue area that you see here, and this is Nassau, is over here in this island, and that's where where the Bahamians have put the Hotel Atlantis. Have any of you been to the hotel? Okay. They knew right away they could make some money off of this. But they were indeed a part of Atlantis, according to Keisi. All of this light blue area was above the waterline in 10,000 BC. So it would have been a huge island. And this, what's called the Little Bahama Bank up here, this is where Freeport is. It would have been a smaller island. And then Andrew Collins has written a wonderful book. Well, he's updated it recently, Atlantis in the Caribbean, and a lot of his focus has been on Cuba, and he believes that there might be some remnants still in that area. Okay, so that's your geography lesson for the day. And again, the funny joke here about the flood control. All right, so we know from last night there were 3 destructions of Atlantis. There was one in around 50,000 BC. He actually gives the date of 50,722 BC. And this was the one where they tried to get rid of the large animals, and they did something that was so destructive that it caused a volcanic upheaval, and there was a pole shift. In 28,000, someone tuned the firestone too high, and there was another period of destruction. And the third one was in 10,000 BC, and that's the one we talked about that may have been done by a comet. But we don't really know. Someone here in the audience has a theory that it might have been some sort of a electrical plasma event that could also have caused this kind of environmental catastrophe. But we do know that something happened at around 10,000 BC. They call it the Younger Dryas comet event. All right, so there were 3 destructions. There were migrations we talked about last night to many, many areas around the world. And I really do believe that's partly why you find that there's almost every country of the world now claims to be Atlantis, that they can show you some set of ruins or some evidence that they believe that Atlantis was located in their country. And it may be because there were people from Atlantis who went and were migrants at the 10,000 BC destruction, or maybe even before that. But Keisi's very clear that Atlantis, the islands of Atlantis, were where the Bahamas is. All right. And of course, how do you prove something like that? Well, the very best way to prove it, besides Greg's discussion of genetics, is if we could find records. And fortunately, the Keisi readings tell us that the Atlanteans knew this final destruction was about to happen. They had some warning about it. They sent people out to look for new places to live, and they compiled all of their information about not only the Atlantean culture, but about the history of mankind going all the way back. All the information that they knew, because they had I'm sure they had a feeling that it wasn't going to be known after a period of time without their civilization and their buildings and all that they had in place at that time. And they probably were able, with their psychic abilities, to also know the future, that things were going to change dramatically around the world. So Keisi says that their records are preserved. They still exist. They said one in the Atlantean land, so that's the Bahamas, one in Egypt near the Sphinx, and another in the Yucatan, or Aryan land, he calls it. So, of course, that wasn't lost on the people back in the 30s and 40s who were getting these readings, 20s, 30s, and 40s who were getting these readings. They immediately started to look around and try to get some idea of where these halls of records might be found. He does say that in these 3 places that the records are all the same. So whatever we find in one place will also be in the other 2 places. He said they were put there by the sons of the Law of One. And what's really interesting is that he says specifically there were 32 tablets, and on those 32 tablets are written their history. Of course, these are not the tablets. He says they're going to be a little bit hard to interpret. They're going to be some combination of Egyptian hieroglyphs and Atlantean language. Now, I like James's idea. He mentioned earlier that perhaps they were advanced enough to know how to put information in a crystal or on silicone, so that possibly we could access the information that way. But Keisi seems to be talking about regular tablets, but maybe not. All right, so what's in those records? And that's a wonderful question. Well, of course, it says it's the history of the Atlantean people. It's really our entire human history. It's who built the pyramids. It's some information about how to build a firestone. Uh-oh. Maybe it's not a good idea that we open it just yet. He said there'll be mummies. There'll be artifacts like linens, musical instruments, things that we'll recognize were particularly, or we won't recognize, but we'll understand this is a part of that particular civilization, and it will give us some idea of who they are. So it's sort of like a time capsule that they left. But one of the most interesting things that's supposed to be in there is it will be a prophecy of who found the halls of records. Now, is that not unusual? So wouldn't it be odd to be the person that opened it up and there's your name written somewhere? That's right, Lora Littleson. No, I got a feeling it's not going to be me. Okay, so when will the records be found? And he says all kinds of things about it. One thing he says is when a change is imminent in the earth. And he talks about the period from 1958 to 1998, which is, he talks about lots of other places as a time of earth changes, when the climate's going to change. And probably a lot of you are familiar with that. But the halls of records, he says, may be opened around that time. Well, we think that probably, one of the things that Keisi said about prophecy is that nothing is written in stone, that choices that we make every day influence what's going to happen in the future. So the future's not set. You can change your own individual future, and of course, as a larger group, as a civilization, we can also impact our future. So the decisions we make may have caused the global warming to be a little slower in coming than it would have been at the time that he was given these readings. But he does talk about shifting of the poles. And then he says they won't be found until the time has been fulfilled, when their changes must be active in this sphere of man's experience. Could he be any vaguer? I know sometimes you get so frustrated. Sometimes with the readings, one of the things that happens is they'll be going along really well and somebody's asking a question, and then all of a sudden the next question is, should I buy real estate in Virginia Beach? And you go, no, you should have asked exactly where is this thing? Or there's one more question you really, really wish they would have asked. But in other readings, we have other hints. He says that there's apparently some change in consciousness that has to occur before the halls of records will be opened. And I can certainly understand that. If there's instructions for how to build a firestone, I do hope that our consciousness has changed a bit by the time we get that set of instructions. And he says not until the fifth root race begins. And as we talked about last night, we're probably in that time frame as well. So what is the fifth root race all about? And another hint that he gives, we won't be able to find the records until man begins to seek within for the creative forces. So in other words, we have the responsibility to work on our own spiritual growth, that's a part of shifting that consciousness. And I think that a lot of you here have been doing that for a number of years. And that, if you think sometimes it hasn't made a difference, what the readings tell us that even a few people can change the overall consciousness. Every thought that we have builds into that collective consciousness. So everything that you've been doing to try to make the world a better place will also help open those records. All right, so back again, as I discussed last night, the root races. First root race was the ethereal beings. Second root race was the Lemurians that were over in the Pacific area. They overlapped with the third root race, the Atlanteans. Someone has asked me too recently, is there a book that has this information in it? And it's not one that we have on the table, but Secrets of the Ancient World that John and Greg and I wrote together, John Van Auken, and Edgar Cayce's Atlantis, which you can also get online. Milius and Lilith, of course, came in 106,000 BC, long time ago, and helped to create the fourth root race that we occupy, these bodies we're in, that are continually changing genetically. And eventually there will be a fifth root race. All right, so where are the records? One of the places that he talks about is the Yucatan. He says specifically where a temple there is overshadowing the Hall of Records. Well, let's see. Where are there temples in the Yucatan? All over the place. That's right. Some beautiful ones. Most are not, or none that I know of are 10,000 BC. Most of them are pretty much in AD time frames. There are a few that may go back to the beginning, first millennium of the BC. But then Casey gave us a couple of more hints, some real specific ones. He says that the records were carried to a place where the University of Pennsylvania, during the last few months of the time that this reading was given, this was 1933, November of 1933, he says that's where one set of records are kept or were buried. He said during the last few months these particular temples were just being uncovered. And in a later reading, he talks about the University of Pennsylvania being involved with it. So you go back to the record, and it wasn't us who did that. The people who were around Casey at the time said, okay, we're calling the University of Pennsylvania and let's see what they're looking for. And there was only one place they were in Central America. And they had done quite a bit in Central America prior to that. But in 1933, they were at a site called Piedras Negras in Guatemala. And this is a map of this particular site. Now remember, this is the classic Maya site that you're seeing a map of here. And this probably doesn't go back any further than 600 BC from what they know at this point. But what we know about Mayan temples are that they build temples on top of temples. They build on sacred sites. So this particular location in Guatemala, I think, was a brilliant decision. Casey talks about in the readings an entity by the name of Iltar, I-L-T-A-R, that he took a group of people and he came and buried these records under a temple. And they said that he had to move them. Apparently, where he put them at first was closer to the coast in the Yucatan, and he said they had to be moved when there were changes in the contours of the land. And that could be as the water was raised after the ice melt happened after 10,000 BC. But I think this is a brilliant place to have put the records because it's in a jungle that takes you, even in these modern times, forever to get to. Greg and I were able to go in 2004, and they take you to the middle of nowhere. You spend the night in an eco lodge where you can hear the howler monkeys just going all night long. They sound like buzzsaws all night long. And the next day you get in a little canoe in the river, the Usumacinta River, and you go for 3 hours on that canoe. If the water level's low enough, you have to get out, pick your canoe up, and carry it part of the way because there's some rapids that you can't get through. And I'm thinking, Iltar, you were brilliant. This is great. Nobody's been able to find these. But when we went, there were a couple places we were really interested in. First of all, and I pointed on the map over there to the sacrificial stone. Casey talks about in his hints that to look for a stone that looks like, or he refers to something that he called a sundial. And of course, to me, a sundial is usually round, and a lot of times it'll have a protruding point on it that catches the shadow. And there's only 2 artifacts that are still left that are round. One of them is this, what's called the sacrificial stone. I've got a picture of it here. This is the type of canoe you go in on the Usumacinta River. These are some of the rapids. Beautiful waterfall. By that time, it's a beautiful waterfall, but you want to say to the driver, let's keep going, because the caimans are starting to float around in that area. Let me go back to the map again. Okay, the areas that we were most interested in was the sacrificial stone. I'll show you a picture of it in a minute. This incredible temple complex called the Acropolis. It's considered one of the finest works of architecture in the classic Maya era. It's built on a tall hill, and back behind it, as an archaeologist told us when we were there, is a really curious temple that's built into the cliffside. One of our theories is that it's very likely that what Iltar did was put the records underground. And if you know much about the ancient Maya sites or the classic Maya sites, you know that many of them have been found to be riddled by caves underneath. And Piedras Negras, there have been no caves found other than just really shallow ones that would not have been a good place to put up any records. But it is the location of the largest cenote in all of Guatemala, which means that probably underneath this particular area where they have this city, it's probably riddled with all kinds of caves. Well, if you were going to try to hide the records, what would you do to the cave entrance of those records? Right, you'd want to cover it with something. So there's a couple of places. There's this, it's called J29. It's a particular temple. And there's a really curious temple here, Temple 013. And 013, everything's really jungle when you go, and the guides take you around. And I think once the guides figured out exactly what we were looking for, they called us over to an opening in Temple 013. And I had already read that Brigham Young University had sent a crew not too long prior to when we were there to dig down under 013. And as they always have trouble with the Mayan temples, because when they built a new temple over the previous one, they would fill in with all kinds of stone. And as soon as they start to dig in, that stone starts to fall on top of the diggers. And so the Brigham Young University researchers tried and tried and tried in that season. They couldn't get under it. It just kept collapsing on them. But what the guides showed us when we were there, they said, put your hand in here. And we stuck our hand in, and you could feel how cool the air was. And it was like a little breeze blowing through there. Now, if you've ever been to Guatemala this was April, right before their rainy season, you know that it is so hot that even Memphis seems cool by comparison. I mean, it was so humid and hot, and, we were just dripping every day. And here our hand was in something so cool, I'd love to have crawled into it. And, of course, what does that mean? It means that most likely there's a cave system that they at least broke partly into that runs underneath the system. There's air coming from somewhere way down deep for it to be cold air. So that's 013 up here. Then when you look at the records from the archaeologist, the University of Pennsylvania archaeologist in 1933, Casey Reading says the Hall of Records is where they were excavating in the last few months, what they had uncovered in the last few months. Well, I went to the University of Pennsylvania, and they let me into their archives, and I went through all of the notes for all of the 8 years that University of Pennsylvania was there. And, of course, I've mostly focused on 1933. And one of the last places that they even extended their season a little bit into the rainy segment. They were here at this temple. This is Temple K5. And K5 is a beautiful temple that has masks on the front of it, jaguar masks on the front of it. And again, it's very near a cliff as well. So 013 built into a cliff, K5 next to a cliff, J29 in the back built into the side of the hill. All right, so here's what it looks like when you arrive at Piedras Negras in Guatemala. And these are what the boats look like going in. One of the wonderful things about Piedras Negras is it had, during this classic period, incredible artistry. They had some of the most beautiful stela that you can imagine, and this beautiful throne. But this is not old enough. These artifacts are not old enough to be Atlantean. But Edgar Cayce tells us that the Mayan people were a mixture of Atlanteans, South Americans, and some people who were indigenous to the area prior to that. So the Mayan culture was influenced by Atlanteans. Now this is the sacrificial stone I was telling you about that looks a little bit like a sundial. I don't know whose children those are that made that trip, but they must be archaeologists' children. They make it look like it's a little playground, but it absolutely is not. The fer-de-lis are everywhere, and it is truly a jungle. There's a carving on the front of the sacrificial stone that shows two people, and it looks like one of them's handing the other a box. Or were those the records, perhaps? Some memory that something important had happened there at some point. This is a drawing of the temple, the Acropolis temple that I mentioned, that is considered such a feat of architecture at this particular site. This is what it looks like now. They've actually cleaned it up some recently. This is Temple K5, where University of Pennsylvania was uncovering at the end of their season in 1933, and you see that jaguar mask. And then a drawing down below of what the temple would have looked like. It had 4 jaguar masks on each side. And that jaguar mask is about 6 feet tall. If I was standing next to it, I only come up to about the bottom of his eye. And we did stand on it, actually. Another thing that's really odd about Piedras Negras is that the Maya name, now Piedras Negras just means black rocks, and the limestone there actually has some chemical elements in it that make it a little bit darker. So the Spanish who came in at that time called it Piedras Negras. But the Maya called that site Yoquib or Yoquibi. And what that means is great entrance or great gateway. So you think, okay, entrance to what? Gateway to what? Well, there's really nothing unusual about where Piedras Negras is. There's a whole bunch of other Maya cities all up and down the Usumacinta River. There's nothing geographically that indicates it would be an entrance to anything particular in that area. It's also curious. This is what's called an emblem glyph. And we're beginning to understand more and more of how to read these Mayan hieroglyphs. They're amazing. They tell lots of stories. And this one is the one that is put when anybody talks about Piedras Negras, this is their name. This is how it's written. And the glyph contains various elements that have different meanings. Well, one of the elements, these 5 dots right here, is an element that's used for burial. Okay, so, well, maybe Piedras Negras has a lot of burials. Nope. No more burials than any other classic Maya site. Absolutely not. They have some of their kings buried in some of the places, but nothing out of the ordinary. It's not a funerary site. So why did they put the emblem glyph for burial in their name? Okay, another interesting thing, I said there was one other feature that was circular that might be the sundial that Casey's referring to, and it's this altar in front of this huge Acropolis site, temple site. There's several altars, and all of them are square except for this one. And it was discovered by the University of Pennsylvania back in the 30s. Well, I'm sure Theobert Mahler back in 1895 also saw it. But this is what it looked like back in the 1930s. These are the workers back in the 1930s delicately moving it across. It's kind of scary to know that they used heavy equipment, they used ropes, and luckily they didn't destroy the whole thing, but it did break. There's another picture of them finding caches of artifacts underneath this particular altar, and the way they went about it, and I couldn't find the picture to add in, is they had pickaxes. So I'm sure there was some sifting at some point. But interestingly enough, there were some artifacts under that do relate to Keisy's predictions about this site. But altar 1 has interested me because it's circular, and it has a number of Mayan hieroglyphs carved along the side. You can see them pretty well on that picture. And at the time that University of Penn was there, nobody knew what those meant. They were just beginning to understand that the stela were generally about the kings. They were memorials to their different kings. But they didn't know what the hieroglyphs meant. And in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, they've made some major improvements in their understanding. So they began to study a lot of these fragments that were left. And this is what the side of altar 1 looks like. And guess what's really interesting about altar 1? It has some really old dates on it. Not 10,000 BC, but it has a story written on the side of it. And it says, in September 7th, 4691 BC, he, and they can't read who the he is, witnessed the holy Piedras Negras Lord. It happened at, and again the name was unreadable, the holy place. And then it says the paddler gods changed the hearthstones. It happened at the edge of the sky at the first 3-stone place. Witnessed it, the holy Piedras Negras Lord. It happened at the 5-flower place. When you first hear that, you think, no, that doesn't mean anything to me. That sounds like a lot of nonsense. But when you read what the archaeologists know about some of these terms, for one thing, the paddler gods show up in all of their mythologies. Paddler gods are in boats, and those boats are coming across the ocean and the rivers. And they're considered mythological because it goes back so far in time. But they're found in all of the classic Maya sites in their mythology. It says it happened at the edge of the sky. Well, if you were looking out at the ocean and the sky, you might call that the edge of the sky. And the 3-stone place, they know, is the place of their creation. In their creation story, the 3-stone place is the place that they began their civilization. And then the 5-flower place shows up in a whole bunch of other sites. Copan, Yaxchilan, several of the other classic Maya sites, and it's known also to be some mythological, spiritually charged place. So sometime 4,000 BC, well before the classic Maya time, they have a story about this particular time frame. Is it Atlantis? You have to wonder. And I thought it was amazing to me that it was on that very circular altar that I had been interested in. So what about circular things? Well, somebody asked, okay, when you go to the Yucatan, are we going to find anything that was Atlantean? And he says yes. The Keisi readings say yes. He says look for the things of the circular magnetized influence. He said they were used to speak to the divine, the spirit of one, spoke to those people as they gathered in their service, and that this was an Atlantean service, an Atlantean ritual that they were practicing. So that was one of the reasons why I was interested in anything circular that had been found. Well, there's a famous Olmec statue of a meditating woman, and she's wearing something called a magnetite disc. Now, if you know very much about the Maya, you know they had mirrors. And the Olmec used a stone that was made of magnetite, which definitely has the magnetizing influence that Keisi talked about. It appears that over time they must not have been able to find as much magnetite because in the classic Maya era they used hematite and pyrite for their mirrors. Still, hematite mirrors are slightly magnetize him, have a little bit of magnetizing influence. And guess what was found in that cache after they used the pickaxes under altar number 1? A hematite disc, one of those mirrors. And what we know that the classic Maya did with them is that they put them on their headsets, on their headdresses, and you see pictures where they're actually show like smoke coming out. And this is where they communed with the spirits. So what I think may have been is that this was sort of an emblem of the Firestone. It was their way of remembering that sacred stone that had been used so many eons before in Atlantis to commune with the spirits. There we go. There's the Maya headdress you can see on the drawing. And they would put the mirror up on their foreheads, of course, near the third eye. Doesn't prove it's Atlantis, but it sure is curious. All right, so have we found the Hall of Records in the Yucatan? Sadly, no. Greg and I went in 2004, and it was a wonderful thing to get to see all this stuff. I had spent so much time looking through reports and looking at the University of Pennsylvania's notes. One of the things that happened after we left, I think things are getting a little bit better, but the Guatemalan government sadly has fallen apart. We could see while we were there these boats coming by on the Usumacinta River like clockwork. They were coming just every hour or so, and they'd be filled with people, and then they'd come back and there wouldn't be any people. They'd be filled with people, and a lot of them had backpacks on. Well, a lot of those at that time, this was 2004, were migrating up to North America. But some of them were also sending drugs forward. And the drug lords in that particular area decided that Piedras Negras was a great place to set up camp. and it probably is, because it's just so jungly and so hard for the officials to get to, and it's just across the river from Mexico. So it's one of the great highways, river highways. So it has not been a very safe place to go to. The archaeologists slip back and forth in the area, but the State Department actually tells you it's not a good idea to go back. And we actually tried to get Guatemalan archaeologists to work with ARE to maybe take a fiber optics and go down through that 013 temple, and they wouldn't touch us with a 10-foot pole, I'm afraid. If some of you may be aware that in the mainstream archaeology, the word Atlantis is like a no-no. It's a career killer. If you are anywhere associated with any of us that are looking for things like halls of records, you're not going to get a grant. You're not going to get tenure at your university. And, we're just kind of verboten. But the archaeologist we dealt with was very kind. And when we asked him about caves and we asked him about some of the temples, he was very forthcoming with what he knew. He was quite happy to talk to us, and we were hoping that meant he would work with us. But he had to decline. All right, so on to Egypt. A lot of work's been done in Egypt. Keisi was, again, very specific. He said that the Hall of Records were located in a chamber between the Sphinx and something he called a pyramid of records. We believe that pyramid was underground because he says it lies along that entrance from the Sphinx to the temple or the pyramid in a pyramid of its own. Sounds like it's an underground pyramid that hasn't been uncovered. Oops, got some formatting issues here. He also says it's really between the Sphinx and the Nile. And again, it won't be opened until the time is right, until the time has been fulfilled. And this is where he says between the Sphinx or the mystery and the Nile or the river. So several researchers have gotten focused on this area I have circled in red. You can see the Nile goes off in this direction. You can't see it on this map. There's the Sphinx. But this area, this is near the right paw of the Sphinx. This area, these are buildings all along. How many of you have been to Egypt? Okay, wonderful. So you know what I'm talking about. It's just like there's this city, and then boom, you're in the desert and there's the pyramids. We all thought we were going to show up there and we'd be in some big desert and we wouldn't see any civilization anywhere near, but it's right there hovering next to the Great Pyramids, or the 3 pyramids and the Sphinx. But somewhere along here is where the Hall of Records is. So there have been lots and lots of ground penetrating radar, lots of attempts to try to locate it. And ARE has been involved with it. Now, some researchers believe this is a really prime area to check. But of course, the difficulty is there's a Muslim cemetery, a little hard to be allowed to dig. And then there's a hill that you can see called Jebel Ghibli that also seems to be of interest. This is a picture of Jebel Ghibli from the Sphinx if you're looking out. So some of you may remember seeing it if you were there. And down below you can see this is the Muslim cemetery, and then there's Jebel Ghibli. All right, so lots and lots of research in Egypt. The ARE has been involved, really mostly behind the scenes. Probably a lot of you have read the literature on it. And this is just a listing of all the things that have been done. People have looked. They have found some anomalies underground in the Giza Plateau. Most of them, they couldn't identify whether it was really a man-made void or man-made hallway. But one of the most interesting was Andrew Collins. Andrew Collins took the idea of the Orion mystery, where you take the 3 stars of Orion and you can place them on top of the 3 pyramids. And he realized as he worked with it that the constellation Cygnus actually fit more closely, still not 100%, but with those 3 pyramids. So he laid that on top, as you can see. And in the process of that, he wanted to know where what was at each of the places besides these 3 pyramids, where the constellation was in connection to the ground. And one of the most important stars of this constellation, Deneb, which had been a pole star, was found to be, when you look at its location, there was a tiny, tiny place called the Tomb of the Birds. How many of you are familiar with Andrew's cave system under Giza Plateau? Okay. Some of you know this story. So he and his wife decided just to go, let's check out this Tomb of the Birds. Let's just see what it is. So they go in. There's nobody there. Everybody's looking at the pyramids and the Sphinx. They're not interested in this little thing called the Tomb of the Birds. Believe me, it's locked up now, but it wasn't back then. And what they found, as they went down to one of the back chambers, they went through a small opening and came into this huge cavern. And to give you an idea of the size, there's Andrew standing in an opening that also goes in the direction of the Sphinx. It goes under the Giza Plateau in the direction of the Sphinx. Is it a tunnel leading to the Hall of Records? It's possible. Some of you may have watched the series that Zahi Hawass did called Chasing Mummies. Okay. He actually went into this cave area. And if you saw it, you probably got tickled like I did, because Zahi has a real fear of bats, which I would too if I was in there. One of the things that Andrew talks about is that the bat guano is so bad in there that he and his wife could not go all the way to the end of the cave. It was just not safe for them to do that. I mean, they covered themselves, but they couldn't go to the end. Well, Zahi had some people with him, and they were trying to see where did this thing end, and it went back quite a ways. And Zahi got upset because of the bats and came running out. He said, well, that's the end of it. It ends. And you can hear this voice of his researcher in the back saying, no, it keeps going. It keeps going. And of course, they never did another show to show you what else is there. John Van Auken keeps in touch with the Egyptian research, and he tells us that the Egyptian archaeologists are aware of it, and it is on their list, on their to-do list. but it's not something that they're working on right now. But interestingly enough, they've put bars over it. You can't just walk in anymore. So they must think it's pretty important. All right. John gave me these slides last year. I do a presentation for our local retreat. And some of you probably have heard the recent thing about the voids in the pyramids. Well, back last November, they had started doing these scans, and they were reporting at that point, John had found out that there were 2 voids they had found, one on the east side of the Great Pyramid and one around the north side. The east side is down low along the edge, and they were using that muon technology that uses cosmic rays, believe it or not, to be able to tell whether there's stone or whether there's just empty space. So they're not doing anything that destroys the pyramids itself. Of course, the Egyptians are very, very protective of their monuments, which they should be. And one of the first what they called hot spots was this area on the east wall. They don't know what's behind it, but they know there's a void. The second one was on the north side near the ancient original entrance to the pyramids. How many of you have been in the Great Pyramid? Okay. You know and you can see in this picture where the tourists are coming in, that's not the original entrance that was built. And there's a void above that entrance. John thought it was interesting that it symbolized that the glyph that's up there symbolizes the horizon of heaven. So again, they don't know what they are, but they realize there's obviously places in the Great Pyramid that have never been discovered before. So they kept going. And just recently, they've released the news that they found another void. And this one is huge. It's 98 by 50 feet. It runs parallel to the Grand Gallery. If you've been in the Great Pyramid, you're aware of how large a piece of the inner workings of the Great Pyramid this part is. The official word is that it could very well be the area where they were able to shift the stones that are the capstones above the king's chamber. And that is possible. They know that's one way that they built the pyramids. But actually they don't know what it is. And there's not any plan at the moment to drill in there to see that at least we're aware of, to see what's in there. And of course, Zahi Hawass is connected to this. He's not the archaeologist working on it, but he's part of the publicity for this. And he's telling everybody just kind of settle down. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's some new area of the pyramid that we don't know about that maybe has something in it. And of course, he's referring to the Hall of Records. But of course, Keisie doesn't say that it's in the Great Pyramid. He seems to indicate it's going to be somewhere over by the Sphinx. However, this is wonderful technology. And if they continue to move forward with this, what's going to happen when they begin to do it around the Giza Plateau in some of these other areas where they're not going to have to dig, not going to have to disturb anything? So have we found the Hall of Records in Egypt? No, not yet. And of course the reason is the time's not right. And it's really been interesting to Greg and I. Really all 3 places have hit a snag about this time. This new information from Egypt is fascinating because it means something's opening up. There is some movement there. But, there's the drug issues in the Yucatan, and then there was the uprising in Egypt and the destabilizing of the government, so that they had problems really with their tourism. If you've been to Egypt recently, you will notice there are no crowds. People I know who have gone have said that it's really a sad thing. ARE's been attached to some people that do tourism there, and it's just really hard on them. So some of what's going on, we think currently, is that they are going ahead and doing some more exploration and publicizing it, hoping to get people back to the tourism again. And in the Bahamas, we've run into a snag as well. But before I tell you about the snag, I'm going to tell you what we did do. So the Bahamas is the 3rd place. But he not only tells us that that the Hall of Records is there, he tells us there's some temples that could be uncovered. Keep that in your head, and we think we found one of them. All right, so I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of the Bahamian research. Let's see how we're doing on time here. All right, but Keisi gave 14,000 readings. That's a lot of readings. And 700 of those readings have at least one reference to Atlantis. The first references occurred in a life reading, and then some other people later wanted to know a little bit more about it, so there's also some series of readings that you can get into. The 364 series is one of the best ones, where they ask some real specific questions about Atlantis. But a lot of the information comes from the large number of people who had life readings in Atlantis. So where was Atlantis? Well, both Keisi and Plato say it's in the Atlantic Ocean. Now, if you ask that question to a lot of other people these days, you'll hear it's in Spain, it's in Santorini. Just about every part of the country has a connection to Atlantis. They'll tell you that's where Atlantis was. And you know, if you have read Keisi's story about Atlantis, that's really not a surprise, because Atlanteans were not just locked into their island. They were connected to people all over the world. And that's part of the story I'm going to tell you about. So they didn't just sit on their island all the time. They got around. But Edgar Keisi is real specific. He says that Atlantis was actually in the Bahamas. In speaking of the records that the Atlanteans left behind, he says one set of the records is in the sunken portions of Atlantis or Poseidia, which is one of the islands that was left, where a portion of the temples may be discovered under the slime of ages of the sea water. And tomorrow you'll get to see a place that we think might be one of those temples that we found in the last few years. And it's just off the coast of Florida. Okay, so a little bit of a geography lesson here. You can see, let me get my pointer here. This is Florida. This is the little teeny tiny island of Bimini. Everywhere that you see sort of brownish color, that's land that's above water. And everywhere that you see really dark blue is really, really deep water. And then everywhere you see this light blue, you see it up here. This is called the Little Bahama Bank. It's about 15 to 20 feet deep. This is the Great Bahama Bank, and you can see that at one time, and in 10,000 BC, when Atlantis had its final destruction, that was an island. Everything that's light blue was above the sea level. So those were part of, according to Edgar Keisi, part of the islands of Atlantis, as was Cuba. All right, so why are we putting so much time and effort into Atlantis? Well, one of the things the Keisi readings tell us is, in order to know where we're going, we better know where we've been. You know, there's that great saying of, if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. And the story of Atlantis is a really important story that relates directly to the times we're in right now. The readings also tell us that if we have an interest in Atlantis, guess what? We were probably had a past life in Atlantis. And he goes on further to say that there's some influence from that life affecting us in this life. So it's not just that we had that life in Atlantis, but we're working on something that we did back in those days. We're either using a talent that we had at that time, or maybe we're undoing some karma that we developed at that time. All right, but in the end, what's important about Atlantis, it's not where it was or how many people lived there or what those people were like, except if it has some value to our human family and if it has some value to our souls. And I do think the story of Atlantis does that. So really in the Keisi readings, what he's telling us about Atlantis is the story of our own soul development. he tells us that with each entrance of our soul into the earth plane, we're here to complete a cycle. And ultimately, each life is to lead us closer to the infinite. He says all souls were created in the beginning and are finding their way back to whence they came. So we're going through a cycle. And I love this quote because it really describes the process. It's a circle or an arc, and it's a revolution. It's a cycle that we're going through. We started out from a divine source, and Keisi tells us this really interesting story about the 4 root races. As James mentioned earlier, we're in the 4th root race currently. But what about those other root races? What else was going on? Well, Keisi's story says that we were created in the beginning as spiritual beings, and we were able to co-create with God. We were totally connected to the infinite. And we found the earth plane. Some of us found the earth plane. And we thought this is a really interesting place. And so we decided to just kind of come in and check it out. We were ethereal beings, but it was just a fascinating place to us. And he tells us this was maybe sometime around 12 million BC. And he said that we were capable of that time, as James mentioned, of entering plant life, animal life, and even mineral life. I love this picture because I think that's what I would have done, would have been to go into a tree or some kind of plant. That would have been the thing I would have been attracted to. And what he goes further to say that they're moved by the Spirit to become that which they found. And they absorbed it into their being, and their being was absorbed as well into the plant, mineral, or animal life. And of course, that's a really interesting thing when you consider the power of gems. If there were people who were coming and going into those types of matter, did they leave an imprint? Or I say people, but souls. And so he ends up in that reading saying it was good and it was bad. It had its good side and its bad side. And part of its bad side was that we didn't just stop by going in and out. We started getting into things like propagation and self-preservation. He said that we began to multiply and really kind of got into having a good time. And gradually, as we began to do these things for our own amusement, we kind of got stuck. We began to harden. We began to find it was more difficult to come and go. And I like to think of that as, probably all of us have experienced going to a movie. And you go in the movie, and sometimes you can get so absorbed that when the movie ends and you walk out of the theater, you feel like you've been someplace else. And your mind is totally in that movie. You're identified with the characters. You've really pushed yourself. You've projected yourself onto that screen. People who play video games all day long and sometimes forget they have babies in cribs or they forget to eat. You know, we do have the capability to project our mind so totally, in such a focused way. All right, so then there's a second root race that we say maybe was around 10 million BC, and those were the Lemurians. Now, they were still spiritual, still partly able to come and go. They had sort of bodies like we experience now. We're not exactly sure. They had male and female in the same bodies. And some in the past, I believed that Lemuria was separate from Atlantis, but actually in the readings, there's some overlap. It looks like that it did not totally end until probably around 20,000 BC or 28,000 BC. But their primary time factor was 10 million BC. And they were also still able to come and go. They partook of the carnal and had a continual hardening. And you notice in that circle, we're going down. And they began this de-evolution, this involution. And then around 200,000 BC, there came another race of Atlanteans. And these people, the Keisi readings describe as a thought people. These people had psychic abilities, but they also had the ability to create thought forms. And they had such great ability. They were beginning to harden. They had a hard time coming back and forth, but they still retained that spiritual connection to the point where they could really do some amazing, amazing things. In fact, one of the readings, the reading on the bottom, talks about that there was a person who got a reading who had been a teacher, and he studied psychology, but his study of psychological thought was the transmission of thought through the ethers. So obviously they were doing some amazing things. And then they also were able to develop more quickly, he says, than some of the other races because they could use the Earth's elements. They knew how to take in the Earth's elements and be able to make that a part of themselves. And part of the reason they could do that is they still understood their oneness with all things. Keecy says they had lots of talents. He said there was almost as many talents as there were different people. They could do a lot of things. They were musicians. They did ironwork. But as James mentioned earlier, as time went on in that 200,000 period, they started to polarize into two groups. There was the Sons of Belial group, who were really into using this power and ability that they had for their own selfish purposes, for power. He said that they really didn't care what kind of hardships they caused other people, and that really they had no standard of morality, that it was really all about self-aggrandizement. That's the first time, when I read the Keecy readings 30-some-odd years ago, it was the first time I'd ever seen that word, self-aggrandizement. And I have pondered it for many years. I thought, what is that really like? Well, I can tell you today, I now understand exactly what self-aggrandizement is. And that's all I'll say about it. All right, and the other group, of course, was the Sons of the Law of One, which James also had talked about. They believed in one wife, one home, one state, one religion, one God, one purpose. And basically, they were involved, they were still connected to the spiritual source, and their philosophy was something Keecy called Christ consciousness. Tom Segru, who wrote Keecy's biography, There's a River, has really the best definition of Christ consciousness, and he asked Keecy in a reading, is this what you mean by Christ consciousness? And it's really a beautiful definition. I know some people like John Van Auken have it memorized. I almost do. But he says that Christ consciousness is the awareness within each soul of its oneness with God, which is imprinted as a pattern on the mind, waiting to be awakened by the will. That was a revelation for me, because I grew up thinking that Christ was just Jesus' last name. But really, Christ is a much bigger thing. And so when Keecy talks about Christ consciousness, the Buddha had Christ consciousness. We all have Christ consciousness. It's just how much we're manifesting it. And Jesus is our Western example of that, a very wonderful pattern, the readings tell us, for the manifestation of the Christ consciousness. And the people in the Law of One were dedicated to that. He also basically says they're dedicated to the golden rule, treat people the way you want to be treated. All right, so physical descriptions of the Atlanteans. This is where it gets a little weird. Now, they could do this thing with thought forms that really got them trapped at some point. And Keecy says that they actually were created monstrosities, combinations of human and animal and even plant characteristics. And of course we have in some of the old mythologies, the Minotaur, the Centaur, we have evidence of that sort of idea. Of course they don't say it's Atlantean, but you wonder where those ideas came from. And so, for example, if a person spent time thinking a lot about things where they were kind of bullheaded, they might actually take on some of those animal characteristics. All right. He also mentions things like mermaids, unicorns. Sweet unicorns were a problem that the Atlanteans created. They were monsters in a way. The satyr, and some of the other things that we can see in some of our ancient drawings. And as he said, they became entangled in matter. And there were people who were told in their life readings that they worked in temples that were dedicated solely to helping people get rid of those entanglements. They might have a few feathers still left on their legs, or they might have a tail, or they might have some things left from that thought form that they had created over time. Now, all of us would like to believe that we were in the law of one, and I'm sure we were. But what you'll find in the Keiси readings oftentimes are people who were in both, that over 200,000 years they had many lifetimes in Atlantis. And sometimes they were in the law of one, and sometimes they, as Keisi would say, they lost in a lifetime when they went over to the other side. They probably saw the pleasure and the fun and the amusement that was going on the Sons of Belial side. So probably, if we're all honest with each other or with ourselves, we have to admit that we're a little bit of both. And so we're probably in this lifetime working out some of that karma for our time that we spent as a son of Belial. All right. Other things that he said about the Atlanteans, that they could be at least 10 to 12 feet in height, and they could also be as small as little people or midgets. He said they were well proportioned. He said they were of the red race. They were a mixture people. He said that they were sort of chameleons. They would take on whatever environment they were in, but basically they were identified as the red race. And he actually identified that a lot of Atlantean migrations went into the northeastern part of the Americas and are represented really well in the Iroquois tribes, the 5 nations of the Iroquois. All right, so the third root race is the Atlanteans, and they're just popping along, and they're hardening, and that Sons of Belial are just getting more and more power. And so something has to change. Well, around 106 BC, the Keisi readings tell us that the Christ soul came into the earth in the form of an entity called Amelius/Lilith, because they were both male and female at that time, and also souls that had never come into the earth plane. They were watching what was going on in Atlantis, and they were worried about their fellow souls, and being people who are there for others and concerned about others, they sacrificed themselves really to come into the earth plane in order to help bring the rest of us back. You know, we all would like to believe that we were some of those morning stars that sang in the morning that came with the Christ, but some of us probably were and some of us weren't. But some of us were with the Christ spirit, and maybe we got stuck as well, which is what happened. So the wonderful thing, though, about Amelius and Lilith is that when they came in, they did something unusual. We don't know exactly what it is, but with what we know about genetics right now, they made some change to the human body at that point, and maybe around 60,000 BC. It's really hard to tell in the Keisi readings. But they created what we call the fourth root race, which were the 5 Adams and Eves in 5 places around the world. They were in those 5 places and created at the same time. And the purpose of creating these new bodies or helping these new bodies to develop was so that they could reach their spiritual source, that they could utilize the chakra system more completely and be able to move forward. So he said the brown people were in South America in the Andes, the black in Africa, the white in the Carpathian Mountains, the yellow in the Gobi or China, and the red were Atlantis and Northeast Americas. And why these particular colors and locations? It just has to do with what the environment, the color had to do with what was needed in that environment. So basically, this is a map of where those 5 Adams and Eves, and these are the modern bodies that we have now, were first presented, and we think it was around 60,000 BC, according to Keisi. All right. So what happens next? And James has mentioned a little bit about this. Well, one of the interesting things is Keecy says there's going to be a fifth root race. And he gives us a few clues as to when it might be going to happen. He says in 1943 in a reading, he said it was in the next few years. And he says that there will be people who will need to prepare for a new race. So we don't know if maybe the baby boomers were brought in to prepare for that new race, or if somehow we're some genetic movement toward the fifth root race. He says the fifth root race will have that full consciousness and ability to communicate with the creative forces. The same thing they had back in Lemuria and Atlantis. And the same challenge will apply. What will be our intention? What will we be using that power and ability for? That comes out in the readings over and over again. You know, power is all in how you use it. We can either create positive karma or not so positive karma. And another interesting thing he says is that the people who are at this fifth root race will know that they are, but the people around them won't necessarily know that there's anything different about those people. So maybe, as James says, it will be a new body, but maybe it'll just be a change in consciousness. And so unless you are aware that you're aware, nobody will know that you're somebody from the fifth root race. We know it's going to be happening around this time because he talks about it's during the Aquarian age. He talks about that it's during the time of the earth changes. All right, further information about Atlantis. Everybody knows there were destructions in Atlantis because it doesn't exist anymore. And I love that the popular comics have picked up on it. And as it says, so your flood control bill didn't make it out of committee. Well, it's not the end of the world. Or is it? All right, so we know from Keecy there were 3 destructions of Atlantis. The first one in 50,722 BC, exactly. There was a group of 5 nations that got together: Atlantis, China, India, Egypt, and South America. They had nations. They were around in 50,000 BC. And they got together to exterminate some kind of large animals. They created a huge explosion that either created a volcanic reaction and changed the poles, but it also destroyed the animals. These may be the animals that were around at that particular time. But one interesting reading tells us that those animals got large because of something that the people of that time did. As he says in the reading, he says, in the enormous animals that had lost control by the influences of the powers of suggestion in the associations of the spirit or the sons of men upon the animal world. So again, when we were in Atlantis, we were messing around with the animals, and, it may be a little bit like dog fights today where, you say, well, I'll make my animal bigger than your animal and we'll see how they do, and, on and on it goes. So again, the misuse of power. And it broke the Atlantean continent up into smaller islands. And the first of the migrations occurred. And the readings talk about that they went, first of all, the Atlanteans that left at that time and some Lemurians who also were affected by this global volcanic event went to the Pyrenees. The Pyrenees, of course, between France and Spain. He also mentions, if you're aware of the Basque people in that particular part of the world, you know that their language is not like the regular. It doesn't have the same root with the Indo-European languages. And people have wondered what that was all about. And he also says in 50,000 BC, the Atlanteans and Lemurians went to South America, which he called Og. Or they called Og back in the day. Second destruction was in 28,000 BC. We have 52 readings that tell us about it. And in this one, he says the firestone was tuned too high. In fact, there was an individual who got a life reading, and he was told in that life reading, you were the person that tuned that firestone too high. And I thought, man, I'm so glad I didn't get that reading. Wouldn't you be embarrassed? And 28,000 BC was the peak of the technological capability, according to Keecy, in Atlantis. But what's a firestone? Now, you guys, when I've given this lecture before, I know there's always been people in the audience that didn't know what a firestone was. But I got a feeling you guys know.
but I'll go ahead and tell it. In the beginning, it was called the white stone or the Towie stone, and it was used for speaking and for communicating with the higher forces, with the infinite, with the divine. It was a very spiritual tool. And of course, as we humans are, when we find out something has power, what do we want to do with it? Yeah, we want to turn it into something for our pleasure, or we want to turn it into a weapon. All right, so again, we had more migrations, this time to the Americas, to Nevada and Colorado, Arizona and Utah. Now, some of those were Lemurians, some of them were Atlanteans. And he talks about in Arizona and Utah that they became the cave dwellers. And Greg and I just this summer were at Painted Rock Petroglyphs in Arizona near Phoenix. It's a wonderful site way out in the boondocks. And they have this ancient migration pathway. You can see on these stones the petroglyphs. And what they understand, what the mainstream people understand about it, is that since at least 10,000 BC, which is the final destruction of Atlantis, there have been people wandering through that area, and they would make their mark on the stones in order to say, I was here, I guess, or to mark maybe for the people coming after them, this is the pathway. But 10,000 BC, they know this site was used. And these are some of the markings. So again, in 28,000 BC, according to Keiser, there were ships in the air, on the water, under the water. We think they had submarines, they had hot air balloons, they had land-based transportation, chariots run by gas, laser surgery, elevators and connecting tubes, electricity, advanced metallurgy, and they could photograph from a distance. They had some abilities. But things began to devolve after that as far as their technology is concerned. But then in 10,000 BC, the final destruction, there's 352 readings that Keiser gave for that time period. And it's never been made clear in the readings exactly what it was that caused that destruction. We know they knew about it in advance because they prepared some records and put them in 3 places around the world. There are also readings that talk about that they went out and looked for places for people to migrate to ahead of time. So it's something that they knew was going to happen. Well, Andrew Collins, who's written several books and I think was here in Hot Springs a couple of years ago at the ارتکیپرز, his theory since really the early 2000s is that it was a comet event. And something that they called the Carolina Bays event, but it's also called the Younger Dryas event. And I think that's pretty significant because Keiser gave a reading about this final destruction. And he says that there weren't really any absolute records kept about it, but he says that record remains in the rocks, or the record in the rocks remains. And I remember seeing that thinking, well, that's just an odd thing. Is he talking about somebody carved some information in a rock? Well, sort of. We know now that there's a line of ash at the 10,000 BC level. It's the Younger Dryas ash line. And I truly believe that's the record in the rocks that Keiser's talking about. That ash line is the kind of thing you would have if there was a comet event. So there was an abrupt climate change. There's a presence of nanodiamonds in this ash, meaning it was a high pressure explosion of some kind. It has high levels of iridium, which had to come from somewhere else. That's not found on Earth. And we know that it caused the extinction of the mammoths and the other mammals, the large mammals, whatever large mammals were remaining. And then we have scientists who have determined that there's quite a large area of impact craters that can be found that date to this time period. It's called the Younger Dryas Boundary or Comet Impact Field. And Greg and I got to see that not too long ago. But this is where they believe that the comet came through, really from up around the Great Lakes and then all down through the southeast. You can find them in the Carolinas. That's where we went. And of course we went thinking, well, we're going to have to look really hard for these things. And as it turned out, all I had to do was turn on my GPS and turn it to Google Earth as we were going down the road, and lo and behold, on either side, you saw these elliptical shapes in the earth. And what's interesting about them, they're all directional. Their directional orientation is the same. They have a consistent magnetic anomaly, and they have these interesting sand rims on the side. Andrew Collins believes that they were explosions, that the comets actually exploded above the Earth, sort of like at the Tunguska area in Siberia, where they know something out of the ordinary happened in the early 20th century. And rather than it be a meteorite that hit, it was something that exploded above. But all of these circles that you see are from some sort of bombardment, but they don't find evidence of meteorites in it. So we visited a place called Jones Lake, and it's actually a state park. And this is just a model of what it looks like. You can see the sand, and each one of these are oriented the same. The sand is blown out in the same direction, and this is what it looks like up close. So people go and swim, have no idea exactly what they're swimming in. So I think there's a pretty good argument that the third destruction and the final destruction of Atlantis was a comet. And of course they might have been able to see that comet ahead of time and know that it was coming. So as I mentioned before, one of the things they did is they started to search for other lands because they realized something was about to happen. And they eventually, according to Keiser, they found lands in lots of places. One were the Iroquois lands in the Northeast Americas, the Southwest America, the Yucatan, the Peruvian Andes, Morocco, Egypt, of course the Pyrenees again, the Gobi, and even Australia. I had not seen that reading before. He says that the Atlanteans were first met by the Bushmen in Australia when they came. He talks about the Iroquois being the pure descendants of the Atlanteans. He talks about near Terre Haute, Chicago, and Dearborn, and around the Erie Lake. He says that in Central America, the Atlanteans had something to do with the temples that are being uncovered today. Well, we know the temples that you can find in the Yucatan are primarily the classic Maya, but if you know much about the classic Maya, they built their temples on top of old temples and on top of older temples and so forth. It's sacred land. So somewhere under all of those temples are some Atlantean remnants, and Keiser does talk about that as well. He talks about someone had a reading where they were told that they were preparing for this migration to the Pyrenees, and their journey was through the air. So at that point, they must still have had some way of traveling through the air. Egypt was a really important place for them to go. Of course, they were traveling back and forth. Remember, Egypt was one of those 5 nations that helped with that first destruction where the large animals were destroyed. But he says that Egypt was a really special place. It was a center of universal activities of nature. And he said it was probably a safe place, least likely to have any more disturbance by convulsive movements, he says, that caused the destruction of Lemuria and Atlantis. Okay, this was a reading on the Gobi land. So basically then, there is no Atlantis. And one of the odd things about about the Bahamas that I didn't mention earlier, is if you ask a mainstream archaeologist, when were the first peoples in the Bahamas, they'll tell you 500 AD. Now, why would it be 500 AD when when Bimini is only 50 miles from Miami currently, and the seas were higher, so it would have been even closer? We know that in 30,000 BC that the people from Indonesia went to Australia and helped to populate Australia. They were taking boats across. So why wasn't anybody coming across from Florida? And we know Florida, the mainstream people admit there were people in Florida as far back as 8,000 BC. So where were they? Well, what the answer is there's no evidence of people in the Bahamas before 500 AD. So what would happen to destroy that evidence? Well, some pretty big destructions, and maybe something like a tsunami that would just wash everything away. And of course you have to consider what's going to last. Paper? Nope. Fabric? Nope. Maybe some stone would last. And of course that's what we're going to talk about tomorrow with the Hall of Records. But Keisie does say there'll be a time when Atlantis will rise again, in the opening of the records. So stay tuned. We'll talk about that tomorrow. And I'm going to leave you then with Greg to tell you the rest of the story that this wonderful mitochondrial DNA is now telling about Atlantis.
And what I want to talk about here is Edgar Keisie's timeline of Atlantis and Mu or Lemurian migrations, and how we might prove that. So, Keisie said the Americas were inhabited prior to 50,000 BC. All right, so Keisie's migrations. The Americas were inhabited before 50,000 BC. Then in 50,000 BC and 28,000 BC, they went to South America, the southwest of America, and the northeast. He specifically mentioned Pennsylvania and Ohio. Again, in 28,000 BC, he said Atlanteans went to the southwest of America and the Andes Mountains. He also mentioned that, strangely, people from China and the South Pacific came to America. And that's the way he said it, China and the South Pacific. Then in 10,000 BC, Atlanteans moved to the Iroquois lands, to the Yucatan, South America, Egypt, etc. So how do we evaluate this? When Keisie said these things, mainstream archaeology believed at that time no one had been in North America or South America before 4,000 BC. That was the belief then, and anything else was preposterous. Nobody was in the Americas before 4,000 BC, and everything Edgar Keisie said was ridiculous. Well, here's how we prove it. Genetics. And look, genetics is not what it seems. And what I'm about to go through here, you have heard about ancient DNA. You've heard about alien DNA. They've gone into Peru and taken the Paracas skulls and they say, okay, it's alien DNA. And it is alien DNA. Almost all of the ancient DNA research being done now is on non-human DNA. But it's found in us. You have more non-human DNA in you than you have human DNA. But it's very, very interesting. Whoever designed us, whoever designed this system, did some amazing work. It's incredible. So, ancient DNA. How do we get to all this? It actually, all ancient DNA research starts with ancient Native Americans. It all did. It's a remarkable story. There's got to be some people in here working in healthcare, right? So you can go back in time, back and look at each mutation back in time, and you can figure out where that mutation began. Where did these people come from? All right, so where is haplogroup X from? It's the only one today that has no known origin. Still don't know. Archaeologists say, well, it had to come from somewhere, but they just say, well, it had to. They don't really know. The American version is called, and you'll hear this, well, the stuff in Europe's different from America. Yeah, it's just a different age. They split back at a certain time. We call it X2 and X2A. It's in the Orkney Islands of Scotland. That's one of the heavy, other than around the Mediterranean, specific places in the Mediterranean, the Orkney Islands of Scotland is where it's in its heaviest. It's been found in France, Spain, the Mediterranean, Israel, Lebanon. There's one group in Lebanon, religious group, that calls themselves the Law of One, that's actually roughly 60% haplogroup X in there. It's living groups of people. It's been found in the Gobi Desert. Never been found in Siberia. Never. Not one case. And it just drives archaeologists crazy. So the mainstream estimate in this is what you'll see if you get online. You will see that they tell you that, these are some of the others, how they hopped to America. Of course, everybody came out of Africa as far as they're concerned. And then as you see these, you'll hit H is that H? I can't see it, but it's probably H, right? Down in Africa? Okay. So it hops out, and then it mutates, and then it eventually gets over to the Americas. And they have estimates here, 26 to 34,000 years ago in North America. And that is for A, C, and D, and partly B. And then they show them going down into South America. There's very little X in South America, but the X that's there is actually exactly where Keisi said they would be. So that's the mainstream belief, or that's what they try to make you believe. But it's not accurate. So let's look at Keisi's Atlantean migrations. In 2002, John Van Auken over here and my wife and I wrote a book, and we put out a number of articles saying that haplogroup X, it's logical. It looks like Atlantean DNA. What do you mean by that? Well, it seems to have come from a central place. And the places where it went is just logical that it went to these places. It has to be from some place that no longer exists because they can't find where it came from. And in a minute, I'll get to another one that archaeologists now say, and geneticists, this comes from a place that no longer exists, and it fits Keisi too. So this is where Keisi said the Atlanteans went. Most heavily in the Iroquois lands, in the southwest of America, in the Yucatan, Mexico. He mentioned Ecuador, the Andes, the Pyrenees Mountains, Morocco, the Gobi Desert, Egypt, and Australia. All of those places. And the little red dots are where haplogroup X is. In Native American mounds, in the skeletal remains found from burials of Native American mounds in the Northeast, which mounds are my biggest interest in all this, haplogroup X is up to 50% of the skeletal remains, which is astonishing. It's almost gone today. It's only 3%, like I said, of living Native Americans. The little dot out here is Kennewick Man. Can't hold this steady. Kennewick Man's out here near Washington State. But it's in the only place here where it's not that Keisi said that there were some was in Australia. Hasn't been found in Australia, but the truth is there's been no ancient remains tested in Australia. None at all. There are places where there hasn't been much testing that's gone on. So, it appears that, like it says Atlantis in the Atlantic there, all the places where it is, where's the logical place that it came from? How did it get to both continents? And we know it dates back to at least 15,000 years ago. There is one variation of it that dates to 10,000 BC. Large groups of people came into North America in 10,000 BC. And for years, from roughly 1937 to the present, American archaeology told us that the Americas were occupied by a group of people called Clovis that came into North America and just took it over in 10,000 BC. Of course, they came from Siberia. According to them, anyway. All right, I'll show you one more. Haplogroup B. I'm at the end, close to the end. Haplogroup B is exceedingly interesting too. And at first, I just knew that it's in the South Pacific. We know now, if you look at this graph, We know that haplogroup B, a specific kind, was in the South Pacific. Those are the people that probably came into South America more than 50,000 years ago. And that's not just me saying it. There's a lot of, everything I'm telling you, other than the Atlantis link to it, is out of the genetics articles. They believe that somebody from haplogroup B came over, large groups, came from Australia and New Zealand and came to South America. I'm working on a project with writer Andrew Collins in England, and we know the following. South America was inhabited long before North America was. It had almost everything first. And if you actually read the South American textbooks, they say that North American archaeologists want to be first. We were first. And North American archaeologists have controlled all the money for a long time. And South American archaeology depends upon money coming from up here. But it's now known that haplogroup B did enter into South America a long, long time ago. And the weird thing is, you're starting to see this. We took this photo at a museum in Arkansas. I saw James just come in, by the way. Lots of giant skeletons recovered in Arkansas, and the one mound that produced more than any other mound in the United States is in Arkansas. And even archaeologists have said that it did. Don't know how many 7 to 8 footers were there, but dozens. One mound. Chickasaba Mound. Chickasaba is in Blytheville, Arkansas, next to the former Blytheville Air Force Base. Still there, as a matter of fact. All right. So there are now, American archaeologists are now saying, okay, so they came to South America by a southern route, which is unheard of. If you actually get on the websites of the federal government showing you what the ocean currents were and are, all you got to do, if you get in a boat in New Zealand and you just let it float, you're going to go right along Antarctica and you're going to go right up the coast of South America. Of course, you're going to have to be able to get some food and water along the way. But life's filled with problems. Anyway. All right, so to just conclude, haplogroup X is older. The one in North America is older than what's over in Europe and what's around the Mediterranean. So that fits Keiси. They came here first. Haplogroup X entered America from the east. That's pretty obvious, and it's now known by some archaeologists, and the Smithsonian believe that it came in from the east. They were called the Solutreans as far as they're concerned. But the Solutrean culture in Europe, which I don't have time to discuss, probably is Atlantean. Haplogroup B, the one that came into South America, is older than X. And it came into the Americas well before 50,000 BC, which is what Keiси said. Came from the South Pacific, which is what Keisi said. And this, I pulled recently an article in Genetics where they're trying to trace where did this version of haplogroup B come from. And they literally say, well, it obviously comes from a no longer existing place, which Lemuria or Mu or Sundaland, but they literally say it comes from a no longer existing place. So they're starting to incorporate some old legends and beliefs that crazy people like us think about. All right. I am done. I thank you. That's hopefully you know everything.
We're going to follow Edgar Cayce's clues. He tells us an incredible story about the origins of the Maya. He tells us that there are Atlantean records, one of 3 sets that were hidden around the world right before the final destruction of Atlantis. And in preparing for this presentation, I had a great time exploring the latest research that has been going on in archaeology in relation to Maya. There are some amazing things that have been happening, and you're going to get to hear about it. All right, so probably don't need to tell you about Edgar Cayce because you're hearing about it from almost every speaker. He is the most documented psychic. There are over 14,000 readings that he gave, over 10,000 topics, and thank goodness one of them was the Maya and Atlantis. This is a picture of the hard copies of the readings. You know, back in the day when Keisi was given the readings, they had a stenographer, they typed things in multiple copies, and they meticulously kept up with each and every reading. And that's unusual to have that level of orderliness. So we have this hard copy set, and when you look at the hard copy set, you really get a feeling for what 14,000 plus is all about. But it's a lot. But fortunately, now that we're in the computer age, we also have them digitized. So one of the things, for those of you who are becoming members of ARE, you can go in the member section and look up anything you want to in the readings. And they have actually a new search engine that makes it a lot easier to do that. All right. So about 80% of those readings were health related. And there are somewhere around 100 readings, a little bit less than 100 readings, where Keisi refers to the Maya and to the Yucatan. And there's one reading in particular, if you really want to go and look, you may want to write down the number 5750-1. And you're going to see references to that reading quite often in my presentation, because in 1933, someone asked the question. You know, that's one of the things about the Keisi readings, that sometimes you get frustrated because they're really on a good track of questions, and suddenly they switch gears and you wish they would have asked one more question. You know, they're searching for a treasure, and then all of a sudden they say, should I buy real estate in Virginia Beach? And you think, no, ask that next question. But somebody did ask, where did the Maya come from? You know, this was 1930s. And they were beginning, the archaeologists had seen the first temples, the European archaeologists had seen the first temples back in the 1700s. Well, they weren't actually archaeologists, they were amateurs that were finding these locations. Then in the late 1800s, they did more studies. And then in the early 20th century, it really began to, archaeology itself began to become a profession. And there was really a lot going on in the 30s. So I can understand why someone asked the question, and I'm so thankful, because that 5750-1 reading gives an amazing amount of information. All right. Back in, and I can't believe it's been this long, about 18 years ago, John Van Auken and I wrote a book called The Lost Hall of Records about the Yucatan Hall of Records. As I said, there were 3 places that the Atlanteans left records of their civilization. Ooh, I'm getting a little music too, aren't I? And we identified 17 clues that we decided to follow up on in that book to see whether or not the Keisi readings could correspond with what we knew scientifically. 5 of the clues had to do with what were the origins of the Maya, and Atlantis and Lemuria were part of their origins, and some other influences. There were 6 clues in particular about the location of the Hall of Records that we followed up on, and 6 clues about something he called an emblem of the firestone. That's the famous stone that was used initially for spiritual purposes and then eventually as a power source by the Atlanteans. And we'll talk more about that. So here we are 18 years later, and the study of archaeology of the Maya has exploded recently because of some new discoveries. So it was really exciting to go back to these clues and see how they compare now. So what we're going to talk about is Keisi's origins. And did you know Keisi also mentioned not only the Atlanteans and Lemurians, but the lost tribes were related to the Maya, which then links the lost tribes, or links the Maya, to the Book of Mormon. How many of you are familiar with the Book of Mormon? Okay, great. And you know there's a fantastic story in there about Central America and about migrations to Central America. We're going to talk about that. We're going to go in specifically about archaeological clues from the Keisi readings, and he was very specific at times. He said in the Yucatan area where a temple there is overshadowing same. Of course, there are lots and lots and lots of temples, but there are more clues that we can pinpoint where we think the Hall of Records is. And then he gave clues about the emblem of the Firestone, and we're going to talk about that as well. And then we're going to get into this amazing new evidence in Central America. How many of you have been watching National Geographic and have seen the recent shows on the radar where they're able to see what's under the canopy in Guatemala particularly, but in Mexico as well? Isn't that amazing? We're going to talk about that today too. In Guatemala alone, they found 60,000 new structures that they did not know existed. And when I show you how little of Guatemala that they've LiDAR'd so far, you're going to be amazed. And it's going to tell us that this is a much bigger civilization than what we had ever thought. So what do the Keeسی readings tell us about the origins of the Maya? Well, first of all, and this again is back in 1933. This is that 5750-1 reading. He says they were a combination of sources, that there were multiple cultures that came together. He said they were a high civilization, that they were influenced by injection of forces from other channels, other sources. So, we are experiencing lots of controversy right now with immigration and people migrating back and forth between countries. But Keisy's story with the Maya is over thousands and thousands of years of cultures coming together and mixing, sometimes blending, sometimes clashing. And it's an incredible story. He says that, for example, there are people from Atlantis and Lemuria during the destruction cycles, and we'll talk about the destructions. He said there were 3 destructions, 50,000, 28,000, and 10,000 BC, well before the mainstream folks think the Maya even existed. But he said those migrations, they came over to South America and to Central America. He talks about an Oz or Og civilization that predated the Inca in South America. He's really telling us that South America was settled way early, that it's one of the earliest civilizations. And I think we're beginning to understand that. If you've been following South American archaeology, you know that in the rainforests, as they've begun to clear them for agriculture, although that we don't want the rainforest to go, one of the positive things from that is that they're finding these earthworks. Incredible numbers of earthworks that indicate that there were civilizations, there were cities, there were settlements, and some of them they know date back to close to 10,000 BC. It's pretty amazing. I don't have time in this presentation to do South America. That's another talk at some point, because it's a massive amount of data coming out, but it does reinforce what Edgar Cayce had to say. He also tells us that there were people in the southwestern portion of America, California, New Mexico, southern New Mexico, and the northern part of Mexico, that he called this area Mu. And they were at one time connected to Lemuria, but then they had their own settlement. But they also came down to Central America. We'll talk more about that. And then, of course, this lost tribes, which he talks about as a mosaic influence. So he's talking about Semitic peoples and possibly the Hebrews that came, that were considered the lost tribes, who were in exile in Babylon and Assyria. But let's real quickly, I did this last year, I'm going to do this really fast this year, the arc of evolution of the root races. It gives you really a good overview of Kayce's story of the history of humanity. It goes back much further than science has any clue about. He tells us we were spiritual beings in the beginning who came in around, he gives a date, roughly 12 million BC. They came in and they were really mostly spiritual, and they decided to sort of project themselves into the earth. Eventually they became what he calls the Lemurians. There aren't a whole lot of readings about them, but there are some. And that date comes up to be about 10 million BC. Then he says about 200,000 BC, there was the Atlantean culture that developed, the red race. And the Atlanteans were in the Atlantic, the Lemurians were in the Pacific. And as you can see from the evolution here, he says the Kayce readings tell us that because we came into matter, we were required to actually go through a period of devolvement where we got so stuck in matter that we had to find a way to pull ourselves back out. He tells us that the Christ spirit came in the form of an entity named Emilius around 106,000 BC and did some kind of tinkering around 60,000 BC with genetics, it sounds like, to make the human body more able to find its spiritual source and to be connected to its divine source. So you can see from the drawing here, that's where we begin to go back up in the arc. So our goal is to get back to our true selves, which is that spiritual ethereal self where we were one with God. The Keecy readings say our ultimate goal is to know ourselves, to be ourselves, and yet to be one with the whole. So we're on our journey back. We got stuck here. We thought it was fun to be in the trees, in the mineral world, in the animal world, and we could come and go at first, and then eventually it got to where we couldn't come and go, and we got into the cycle of reincarnation. So he tells us, and John spoke about this, that we're actually on the way back up in our consciousness, and the fifth root race is the next evolutionary level, a major shift in consciousness that may occur, as John says from the pyramid calendar, that may occur in 2038. Other readings say it may be those people are already being born at this time. Some of the readings indicate it's not necessarily a physical change, but it may just be a consciousness change. All right, now that's the really quick version of the evolution, the arc of evolution. If you want to hear it in a little more detail, I think on my presentation last year is on YouTube. I don't know if it's supposed to be there, but I noticed someone told me it's there. Okay. So one of the other things that Keecy tells us about the Atlanteans that's important to know for the Maya is that over time, over those 200,000 years, they began to polarize into two groups. There was the sons of Belial, who were very selfish, self-aggrandizing. They liked power. They liked control. They liked technology. They were a big reason that the Firestone got used later on for things like lasers and weapons, and also for some good things like medical care and powering vehicles. They were apparently, or at least around the 28,000 time frame, pretty technically advanced. We think after that second destruction that Keecy's telling us they began to decline somewhat. But still, there was this group that were pretty self-centered, were pretty much all about themselves. And then there was another group called the Sons of the Law of One, who tried to stay true to their spiritual source. They used the Firestone or the Towie stone as a means, it was a quartz crystal probably, and they used it to commune with the spiritual world. And Keecy says that they actually spoke to the angels. So in the beginning, in that arc of evolution, we were a part of God, and we knew we were, and we had consciousness of that connection. And the Sons of the Law of One tried to continue that connection. And they were all about oneness, and my brother, they were their brother's keeper. They took care of each other. So they called themselves the Law of one wife, one home, one state, one religion, one God, one purpose. So there was more of a oneness in that group. And both of those groups were still in existence at the final destruction of Atlantis. All right, so the three destructions, the first one was around 50,000 BC. The story in Keecy is that they got together heads of nations around the world, and I always think this is so interesting. We think that Atlantis was the only thing in existence back in 50,000 BC, but the Keecy readings tell us there were people in India, in Egypt, in South America, in China, and they came together to try to figure out how to get rid of these megafauna that were apparently causing people problems. We don't know exactly what they did, but something that they did created a geologic catastrophe, either a volcanic upheaval or there was a pole shift, something, and it caused the continent of Atlantis to break up into 5 islands. Then in 28,000 BC, we have about 52 readings from Keecy on that. There was another destruction that occurred because they were beginning to use a firestone, or they were using it as a power source, and it apparently had to be tuned. And there's one person who got a reading who was told that they were the person who tuned it too high and caused the destruction. Aren't you glad you weren't that guy, huh? What a responsibility, what a karmic responsibility to have. And in this life, he was an engineer again, and he asked a lot of engineering questions. In fact, he gives quite a bit of information about the firestone in his readings. It's the 440 readings. Then the final destruction is around 10,000 BC, and the interesting thing is that they knew it was coming, so they put together 3 sets of records of their civilization, and put one in Egypt, one in the Yucatan, and one they kept in a temple probably in the area of the Bahamas near Bimini, where the last islands of Atlantis were. We don't know what this catastrophe was. There are a lot of speculation about it, but one of the best theories, I think, is that it was a comet event, what they call the Younger Dryas comet event, that occurred around 10,000 BC. Went over a big part of Northeast America, over the Bahamas, which is where Keiси says Atlantis was, and even got over somewhat into Europe. I believe that Andrew Collins is going to talk about that. I'm also going to go ahead right now and make a plug for a book he has out on his book table, Atlantis in the Caribbean. This is an update on his Gateway to Atlantis. When Greg and I first got interested in Atlantis, we used Gateway to Atlantis as our major research source. You can't find a better researcher than Andrew Collins. So if you're interested in knowing more about the Younger Dryas Comet event, more about Atlantis, more about even about the Maya that I'm going to have time to tell you, this is a good book to get. And it's on his book table, Atlantis in the Caribbean. I wish I had written it. Okay, one of the things Keiси tells us real specifically that there were lots of migrations after all of these destructions. And I know this is a lot of arrows, kind of a busy slide to put up, but I've color-coded some of the places that he talked about that people went at 10,000 BC, 50,000, and 28,000. So you can see there was a lot of activity to South America, some to the Yucatan area, especially in 28,000 and 10,000 BC, and then other places around the world. And as Greg talked about last year, almost every one of these places has that mitochondrial DNA haplogroup X that we think is associated with Atlanteans because they cannot find its origin. Every other haplogroup, they could find a place of origin where it probably came from, where those people originally came from, but X they can't find. But interestingly enough, all the places Keisi said that people migrated to especially after the final destruction of Atlantis, has the largest proportions of the X haplogroups. All right, but what did he say about the Maya? Well, again, a combination of sources, and you can see there's Lemurian migrations to Mu and to South America, that in blue, in 50,000 and 28,000 BC. The Lemurians were impacted by these destructions as well as the Atlanteans, according to Keisi. But the biggest, and let me say, also Keisi says those people from Oz and Og, that he called Oz and Og, from the Peruvian and Andes area that had already been settled by Lemurians and Atlanteans and already had a high civilization, they came up also to the Yucatan. So by the time the Atlanteans got there, they had some of their earlier migration people were up there as well. There were lots of different cultures. And then there's that curious thing he tells about the lost tribes. He says they came across the Pacific, landed in the southwestern part of the United States, and in Mu, and then migrated down to the Yucatan as well. And they had a great influence, he said, on the tendency toward human sacrifice among the Maya, that somehow their way that they did sacrifice got mutated by the people at that time and became human sacrifice. And then eventually some of the people from the Yucatan, Keisi says, went up and became the mound builders in North America. So there's really a major influence. So people are moving all the time. Migration is apparently a normal thing that happens in the human experience. In that 5750 reading also, there's a great story about one particular individual who was an Atlantean who brought the records over to the Yucatan. His name was Iltar. We even get a name. And he brought 10 people with him. They came across the ocean, which Atlantis there in the Bahamas is not that far from the Yucatan. And they came deliberately before the destruction. They knew it was going to happen. And they came to start a new civilization. He says that that temple will rise again. And we do know that the classic Maya, the ones that we hear the most about, did have writing. They had an incredibly complex hieroglyphic system that they're just beginning to decipher. And that's one of the things that I love to go and check every so often to see what they've deciphered lately, because that's where the information is. But an interesting thing Keisie says about Iltar is that he came to bring a civilization, a culture to the Yucatan that was very much like Atlantis. He says, and there began the activities of the peoples there, the development into a civilization that rose much in the same manner as that which had been in the Atlantean land. Wow. So 10,000 BC, they brought what they had from Atlantis, what they were doing from Atlantis. They were trying to recreate that. So the next question might be, well, where are the flying machines? Where are the boats? Where's the, where are is the technology? Well, remember, the technology began to go down somewhat by 10,000 BC, but it was still there. But Iltar was a member of the Law of One. They led a simpler life. And what he brought was more of that oneness, of the sense of community, and a much simpler lifestyle. But of course, those sons of Belial made their way over as well. And in the Maya culture, you can see this clash of, there are peaceful times, there are war times, and there's obviously some kind of clash of cultures. So what's this have to do then with the new evidence in Central America? Well, one of the things that, if you look at Keisie's story of Atlanteans coming to the Yucatan, you would say to yourself, well, wait a minute. The Yucatan should be a really highly developed culture, a highly developed civilization. They had the benefit of all this knowledge from Atlantis. Why didn't they become this huge civilization, huge culture? And of course, what we have gotten through the years until about 5 or 10 years ago, what we mostly were told by archaeologists were about these wonderful temple sites that they had gone to. And they wanted to go to the temples because they wanted to dig up the rulers. They wanted to get the hieroglyphs from the temples and the stela. And so that's what we thought were these Maya cities, and that's where everybody lived. Well, guess what? That's not true. What they know now, because of the LIDAR studies, is that the Maya was an incredibly large civilization. Now, what LIDAR stands for is light detection and ranging. It's really a laser radar system that can cut through the canopy of trees, the jungle, and also tell not just stones underneath, but it can pick up on any kind of terracing, any kind of movement of the earth. And what they found is that the major cities were a lot like ours. If you're familiar with places like Atlanta and Nashville, you know that they're not just their inner city, but in most cases they have multiple counties with suburban sprawl where people have spread out, and it's really a huge, huge area. If we were to disappear in the United States all of a sudden and growth go over all of our cities, what would they find? They would find remnants of highways connecting places. They would find suburbs around our cities, but it would take a while to dig them out. Well, that's what they're finding with the LIDAR studies. They find that these major cities that they've been studying are linked by causeways, much more. They knew there were some causeways, but they didn't realize how many there were and how obvious it was that the trade was going back and forth. They all knew about each other. It's caused them to increase their estimates of how many people were there during just the classic Maya period. They used to say about 3 to 5 million. Now they know, just with the little bit of LIDAR they've done, it's probably more like 15 to 20 million people. And this is the first millennia AD. We're not even talking about back when Iltar was there. There's evidence that people lived in places they thought, that the archaeologists thought were uninhabitable. There were swampy areas that they thought, well, there's no way they can live here. Well, what did they do? They terraced them. They put ditches. They drained them. They knew how to take care of the land and how to live on the land. And then they realized there was a lot more agricultural areas than they thought. Because if you have 15 to 20 million people, you better be able to feed them. And those agricultural remnants are there. They're blown away. If you read some of their articles, they're all just kind of, putting their hands up and just in awe of what the LIDAR has so far shown. So here's an example in Cibal, Guatemala. And most of this has been done in northern Guatemala. But I'll show you a map that shows you where the LIDAR has been done. But you can see there's a temple, a reconstructed temple that they knew about, obviously, because we reconstructed it. But under this canopy of jungle, they found more platforms, pyramids. They know there's a modern path. They know that's not an ancient path. Residential areas. This is what the LIDAR would look like compared to the jungle. If you've watched the National Geographic special, you know that there's also some kind of device that the archaeologists can actually hold in their hand that does LIDAR. It looks like an iPad. And there's an archaeologist that shows these pictures. And at the top, this is what it looks like to the naked eye. When he puts the LIDAR up, what do you see off to your right in the bottom? A pyramid. And apparently, sometimes you could walk through there and not even know you could pass a pyramid right by because there's so much vegetation. So they're extremely excited, and I think a little bit daunted as well, because they already have trouble getting enough funding to excavate the sites they do know about. Now they're finding they're everywhere. They're a little bit closed-mouthed about where some of these sites are, which is smart, because the looters are happy to see the LIDAR as well. Probably will get their own set at some point, sadly. But one of the places that has really surprised them is Tikal. Now you think Tikal's big tourist destination in Guatemala. How many of you have been to Tikal? Yeah, I figured you probably had. It's not that hard to get to. We think we know the site. It has some incredible temples in it. Well, they did the LIDAR with it, and they see that it's so much bigger than they thought. All the outlying areas around it, that instead of 10,000 people living there at the classic time, they're sure at least 50,000 people live there. And probably more. That's probably a conservative estimate. And this is a picture that gives you an idea of the suburban sprawl, as I call it, around some of these sites. And you can see Tikal down in the bottom there. The red area is the center city that we're all used to going to see as tourists. And the yellow area around each of these centers is the suburban sprawl that they know of through LIDAR currently. And these are just a few sites in northern Guatemala. This doesn't even get into Mexico or southern Guatemala. Caracol in Belize, they've done a few LIDAR studies there. And if you go to Caracol, they take you to the inner city, which is actually this denser area down here toward the middle left of the screen. But this other area is their suburban sprawl, and you see the really complex network of causeways that go through the area. People were wanting to get to the center area. And they see lots of water reservoirs so that they could take care of the needs of lots of people. They see lots of agricultural terracing. So this map shows you, and of course this was my question, well, how many places have they done LIDAR on, and have they been to Piedras Negras, which is the place we think that Casey's telling us that the Hall of Records is located. And so I'm looking on the map. They're probably close, but you can see they don't really tell you where they are. You have to kind of figure out. And the LIDAR is the little bitty red squares. Do you see those? Kind of up and down. They look like lines, but they're little bitty rectangles. And those are the areas that they've LIDAR'd so far. And as you can see, they've only scraped the surface. It's amazing. This is changing everything in Maya archaeology. And hopefully the archaeologists will get to it before the looters do. The second thing that blew my mind as I was preparing for this presentation was this quote from Richard Hansen, who's been working in a site called El Mirador in Guatemala now since the early 2000s. They knew it was what they call a pre-classic site, which means it's sometime BC, still in the first millennia BC, so not as old as we're trying to get to. But one of the things that Richard Hansen realized as he was looking at this pre-classic area, and this is a mainstream guy, he said, I realized the whole evolutionary model for the economic, cultural, and social history of the Maya was wrong. The idea that the Maya slowly became more sophisticated was wrong. And the reason was he found that the pre-classic people had hieroglyphs, they had knowledge of the Popol Vuh and the early creation story. There was not much difference. They could see a few things that were different, but they were just as advanced. So my theory is keep on digging, Mr. Hansen, Dr. Hansen, because I'm sure you're going to find it goes back even further. This site at El Mirador, to give you an idea, you can see it here. It's at the top of Belize. It's not that far from Tikal and Piedras Negras. It's a part of that really dense area of classic Maya sites that were in the northern part of Guatemala. It has an incredibly large pyramid. It has the largest pyramid that they've found so far in the classic Maya era. It's 230 feet tall. And for those of you who've been to Tikal, you'll appreciate this picture. If they took the Ladante pyramid and put it on top of Tikal, it would encompass all of those huge temples that we all climb up to go see, and the big platform. It's a huge, huge pyramid. And this was a pre-classic site. They also had another one that was 180 feet tall called El Tigre. And fortunately for all of us, they're preparing it for tourism, and hopefully we can all make our way there eventually. But this is the frieze that Hansen found that really excited him, that he believes is the Maya creation story of the hero twins. And you see a Mayan figure swimming under the water. This is where he's supposed to go and get the severed head of his father in the story. So what is the mainstream folks? What is their timeline? Well, it's pretty limited, really. Anything before 1500 BC they call archaic. In other words, they don't know about it. The pre-classic period they push back to maybe 1800 BC. But one of the things that's different from when John and I wrote the book 20 years ago or 18 years ago, back then they were saying that the Olmec were the precursors to the Maya. And some archaeologists still say that. Now they know the Olmec, the Teotihuacans. How many of you have been to Teotihuacan in Mexico? Those people, the Maya, the Zapotecs, they were all around in that BC era, in that first millennia BC. They were parallel cultures. They were not the seed of each other, but they did influence each other. So their timeline doesn't match Casey's at all, but things are beginning to go further and further back. And this gives you an idea of the different cultures. You see in pink the Olmec area, the Gulf Coast area, the Zapotec area. In yellow, the Oaxacans over on the Pacific side. You see the Teotihuacans there in the Central Plateau. And then the green area is the Maya area. And so going back to what Casey said about it being a combination of sources, a lot of different forces came in. You can see there were cultures that were there all at the same time. and with really different artwork, really different types of writing. They were related, they knew about each other, they interacted, but they also had their own areas. So let's see if we can find anything that goes back a little further than 1500 BC. Well, there's been some more discoveries. Back actually before 2012, there was a skeleton found in a submerged cave that was dated to 11 to 10,000 BC. They call this one of the first settlers of the Americas. Of course, Keisi tells us it goes back much further than that, but okay, the archaeologists are beginning to catch up with us. So an underwater cave, how do skeletons get down there? Well, we know that in cenotes, sometimes on the classic Maya sites, they would put bodies in for human sacrifice, so they found skeletons, for example, at Chichen Itza, and they also have found different artifacts that were probably put in as offerings. But these caves are only reached by scuba diving. And you have to be an expert cave diver to get there because these are some long caves. Well, they've been continuing to explore, and they got really excited because they found a second segment of this under-submerged cave. And now the whole thing is connected, and they think there are at least 216 miles of this submerged cave. Now we know that the Yucatan Peninsula and really a lot of Central America is limestone that has lots of these cenotes and underground rivers, and so there are a lot of these caves under there. They became submerged sometime between 10,000 BC and probably 6,000 BC after the last ice age, and the melt of the ice raised the ocean level around 300 feet. It was gradual over time. Well, this one excites me, not only because they found extinct animals in there, fossils of proto-elephants, which Plato talks about elephants in Atlantis, if you remember, in his discourses, and people have said, well, there's no elephants in the Caribbean area. But also they found a Maya altar. Okay, I couldn't find a picture of the altar itself, but I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, how did that altar get in there? Did we have an ancient Mayan who took a deep breath, got down in the cave, swum in there with this big heavy altar and laid it in there for some reason? Well, probably not likely. And then to even make it more unlikely, you see this hand up here as part of a statue. And it's an incense holder. It's a statue that was used as an incense holder. Well, it'd be a little hard to light the incense in the submerged underwater cave, right? So the evidence is starting to pile up that, hey, maybe there were people who had a culture similar to this classic Maya era that we know so much about that were around at the time that these caves were not submerged. So 10,000 BC and maybe a little bit after 10,000 BC. The archaeologists say they're hoping to find paper and textiles because sometimes they can survive underwater. I'm surprised to hear that. But if so, then they might be able to find some writing. Okay, so what do the Aztecs and the Mayas themselves tell you about their place of origin? Where do they say they came from? Well, they have some amazing stories. The Aztecs say they came from a place of 7 caves, and that they migrated from an island paradise called Azatlan. Let's see, what does that sound like? They said they came south. Some people believe they might have come from that area of Mu, the southwest United States, but either thing is interesting to know. There were migrations. They say they came out of a cave that had 7 openings to it and that there were 7 tribes. Well, there's an example of 7 probably separate cultures, separate groups. And one of their stories says they were run out of the caves in Azatlan by some tyrannical rulers. Who might that be? Sons of Belial, maybe? Some of the codices show paddlers, people paddling across the ocean from Azatlan to the mainland. And this is one of the theories that Azatlan might be the southwest portion of the United States, which Keisi called Mu. The Mayans have an origin of about god, well, a person they call a god. They also call him the first father, Itzamna. Of course, most of us were, when we saw that for the first time, most of the people who have been looking at Casey's readings on Atlantis or on the Maya have marveled that Iltar and Itzamna, you just wonder if there's any connection, but maybe not. But the story about Itzamna is interesting. He paddled with 2 companions over the sea to a place of 3 stones. And those 3 stones then were symbolized by a turtle shell that cracked, and he emerged from the turtle shell. This is their mythology. So that he could be reborn and create a new universe. That sounds like somebody who's moving to a new place, starting over, and creating a new civilization, which is what Keisi talked about with Iltar. They also go on to describe Itzamna. He's their highest god. Sometimes they call him God D. He usually has a hooked nose, so you can usually pick him out of most of the artwork. But he taught the people writing, medicine, the arts, the sciences. He was a high priest of divination. And we know those Law of One people were able to still use the Towie stone or the fire stone to communicate with the higher forces, the divine forces. He's also depicted with a hooked nose, and he often has a headdress that has a mirror on it. And I see that my formatting doesn't show what's after the word beaded, but it is a mirror. And usually it's up in the headdress, and you see that a lot. We're going to get to those mirrors were important. All right. He's also part of what are called the paddler gods, and Greg's going to talk a little bit about that. He's the person in the middle who's always brought over by these 2 paddlers. Greg's going to talk about it because it also relates to their afterlife story, what happens to the soul after death. But they tell us that it is their origins. This is where they came from. It's so important that even in the classic Maya era at Tikal, the rulers would connect themselves, and they claimed that these were their ancestors, that the paddler gods and that Itzamna was their ancestor, and they would actually dress like Itzamna and reenact at each of the particular times of the year, usually the calendar ending time, as a purification ritual. With their altars, they would honor those ancestors. And what a great way to remember your Atlantean story. All right. Another great and interesting find in the last 18 years was in 2005 in San Bartolo, Guatemala. All these things keep happening in Guatemala. An archaeologist was taking a lunch break, and he decided to get a cool spot in a looter's trench, and he kind of fell down into the trench. And when he stood up to look around, he realized there was a mural in there. There are very few Mayan murals that have survived, but this one was incredible because it was a pre-classic site. And even in 2005, pre-classic people didn't have hieroglyphs. Pre-classic people didn't paint murals. They were not sophisticated. They were almost like cave people. They were what they called the proto-Maya. They couldn't do all these things. Well, yeah, they can. And it's a beautiful artwork. This is an artist's rendition of a piece of that mural. Well, guess what the mural's all about inside this temple? Their creation story, their origin story, the sacred story of the paddler gods, of Itzamna rising from the turtle shell. And that's him in the center there. So some of the people who are also getting really good at deciphering the hieroglyphs, I got into those articles as well, and I got really excited by this quote. Some people believe the turtle cave is really about the earth, about Itzamna coming out of the earth, a crack in the earth. But actually, if you look at all the mythological stories, the turtle shell. Am I doing this? The turtle shell can actually refer to a mythical place beyond the horizon. So if you're on the coast and you're looking out at the ocean, what do you see? Just that flat horizon. And it can only be reached, the other side of the sea can only be reached on the back of a turtle. Interesting. Especially since the Olmecs have another story, and there's a codex that was drawn of people riding turtles. And I love how it's one person per turtle. But their origin story talk about a cave in the middle of the sea, and that their ancestors came over to the Gulf Coast riding on these turtles, in ancient times. So it makes me wonder if the Atlanteans had jet skis, maybe. I don't know. That look like turtles. Or maybe they just we know that the Atlanteans had a connection to nature, to the animal kingdom, to the plant kingdom, and maybe there was something in their relationship with turtles. Maybe they were really turtles that they rode. But it's an interesting story. And turtles keep coming up in this old mythological story. And that's going to be important when we get to Piedras Negras. All right, so lost tribes and the Book of Mormon. Well, those of you who know about the Book of Mormon know that it tells a tale. It tells a story of, well, let me first start with Keisi. Keisi talks about the lost tribes in two ways. One are the people that we traditionally call the lost tribes, who were part of those 12 that were captured and taken to Persia and Assyria in 700 BC, and some that they don't know what happened to. Even archaeologists don't know what happened to them. And then, but Keisi talks about an earlier group that fled around 3000 BC, which around the time of the Tower of Babel or the flood. Okay. He says they arrived by boat. And some of these earlier people later people from 700 BC, he says settled in England, might have been related to Stonehenge. But he said that the group that impacted the Maya came 3,000 years before the Prince of Peace, before Christ, by boat. And he interestingly says that there was something about the information that they brought that later got turned into human sacrifice, that initially the altars were used for purification purposes, similarly to how they were used in the Law of One, as Keisi describes with the Towie stone. The Law of One talked about communing with the angels on the altars. And apparently, and we do see that in the classic Maya culture, there was definitely human sacrifice. Keisi also says to look at the architecture, that the ruins, because of this mosaic influence, that you have a blend of things around the Mediterranean and South America. So he says these ruins that we're seeing in the Maya area in the 1930s had an Egyptian, Lemurian, and Oz, which is the Andes in South America, civilizations, as well as mosaic activities. So a lot of people have pointed out how similar pyramid building is around the world, and what a interesting thing that is. How were they connected? And of course they question that because supposedly people were not connected to each other that far back. But we know through the Keisi readings, that they were. All right, so the Book of Mormon talks about three migrations. First of all, in 2400 BC, they came across the Pacific, and this was sometime after the Tower of Babel, and landed near the Yucatan, but on the Pacific side. Second migration was a group they called the Mulukites, and they ended up in Levanta, near where the Olmec were. And as most of you probably know, there's really a mystery among the Olmec sculptures that there are lots of figures depicted with beards. And the Maya technically have trouble. Most Native Americans don't grow beards. That's an unusual feature. So there's been a lot of discussion about transoceanic contact well before Columbus for that reason. And the Book of Mormon seems to support that as well. And then the third group, and this is the group that lasted a little bit longer, they came in 600 BC, traveled over the Pacific, and landed in the Guatemalan highlands, and eventually migrated even up to where the mound builders are. And there were two groups, Nephites and Lamanites, and they were almost always at war with each other.
So where did this story come from? If you know the story of Joseph Smith, you know that he was visited by an angel in 1823 and told that there was a box of golden plates that he needed to go unearth, and it was in a mound in New York. He went there, he got them, and there were witnesses who saw the plates, but of course no one has pictures of them. In the box, this is the only record we have of them, the Anthon transcript, where somebody tried to write down examples of what the script looked like on the golden plates. Joseph Smith could not read those plates. However, in the box he was given seer stones. And what came in the box were these two crystals that look like glasses in kind of a bow-shaped set of glasses. This is just a reproduction. They've lost the original glasses. They don't know where they are. But they were called the Urim and Thummim. And if you know much about scriptural history, the Hebrews in the Old Testament would go into the Holy of Holies and do divination with the Urim and the Thummim back in the Old Testament times. But only the Levites, only the high priest could do it. They wore the sacred breastplate that I believe it was James Tiburon that in his presentation showed you all the different gems that are in the breastplate. Those were in the box. So what Joseph Smith would do is he'd take that set of glasses, put his head in a hat, and really he channeled the information and someone wrote it down. And that's what created the Book of Mormon. This second stone, brown stone, it's a type of jasper with some iron in it, was his personal seer stone. After he lost the glasses somewhere along the line, he was doing divination, and they have this in Utah, Salt Lake City. And this is the real stone that he used later when he lost the glasses. Interesting story. And what was interesting to me when I learned of it the first time was that one of the two universities that have studied Piedras Negras, the site where we think the Hall of Records is, was University of Pennsylvania in the 30s, and in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Brigham Young University. And I'm thankful to the Book of Mormon because there's been a lot of funding from that church for Mayan archaeology, because they wanted to follow up on this story in the Book of Mormon and try to figure out, was this a true historical story about these times. And it's interesting how it dovetails somewhat with Keicy. No one ever asked Keicy in a reading about the connection to the Mormons, but there is a letter where someone asked him what he thought of the Book of Mormon, and he just answers, this is the waking Keicy. He just said there's a lot of truth in it, but doesn't go into any detail about which parts that he's talking about. All right, so there's 6 clues then about the Hall of Records that we followed up on. What are the Hall of Records? What's in the Hall of Records? I went through that last time, so real quickly, that we think it's, Keicy says it's 32 tablets are in the records. They're in a language that's partly Egyptian, partly Atlantean. And besides the tablets, what the tablets tell is the history of mankind, the history that we really don't know, that goes back so much further. But there are also some artifacts like mummies and musical instruments and precious stones. Yeah, you have to put gold in there so people will look for it, right? Menus, cakes of unleavened bread, various life seals, and probably on the tablets are the instructions for how to build a firestone. I'm a little concerned. I'm not sure I'm in a hurry for us to find that. All we need is another weapon. And also pyramid building, so that we finally learn how the pyramids were built. So there's a lot of interesting information. Now, when will the records be found? Keicy's kind of iffy on that. He talks about it being around the time of earth changes. Well, okay. We might be close to that. He also says, though, that there have to be changes internally. There has to be a shift in consciousness. When we begin seeking into those realms within the inner self for a knowledge of the close relationship with the creative forces, which sounds like to me, when we begin to become spiritualized enough, then these places will be opened. And then, of course, when the 5th root race begins.
So where are the records? As I said before, in the Atlantean land, so somewhere around Bimini in the Bahamas, maybe in Cuba. In the Egyptian land near the Sphinx, and of course somewhere in the Yucatan. And that's what we were concerned about for this book. And of course he says the Temple of Iltar will rise again. The first clue about the records, he says the records are in the rock. And 20 years ago when I saw this, I thought, well, okay, he's talking about the tablets. They're carved into the rock. I don't think that now. I think the record in the rock is the evidence for the Younger Dryas event in 10,000 BC. You see the ash line across here? You see that all over the area that was hit by the comets. And it's a real geologic record. It's something that can't be taken away. And I do believe that's what he means by the record in the rocks. Second one is that the records will be found in a second temple that will rise again and be opened. So it's not the first temple, which we think probably was on the Gulf Coast, but a second temple. So, you know, Keiси says that he first put the records, Iltar put the records somewhere in a place that was destroyed in that final destruction of Atlantis when there were changes in the contours of the land, which makes you think that it's the coastline. Something happened with the coastline. Okay. Use this one. Okay. Well, we tried, didn't we? Okay. Some people believe that that first temple might be in Belize. And you see Belize is right there around the Maya lowlands there. Keiси called it the British Honduras. That was the name at that particular time for that area. Now we call it Belize. And there are some incredible sites there. Caracol is probably one of the most interesting. And it has some pre-Maya evidence, pre-classic evidence. Okay, there's Belize. And I just want to show you where the Usumacinta River comes in and heads toward Piedras Negras. So that's really on two different sides of the peninsula. And he says, this is the best clue of all. He says the records are in a place where the stones were uncovered during 1933 by the University of Pennsylvania. Now, he doesn't say in the reading exactly the University of Pennsylvania. He says the records that were carried to what is now the Yucatan in America, where these stones that they know so little about are now, during the last few months, being uncovered. Then there's a second reading that was a follow-up to this, where someone asked specifically, what should we tell the University of Pennsylvania about these stones that they're uncovering so that they know what they're looking for? And Keisi said, or should we tell them? And Keisi says yes. So that's our link to the University of Pennsylvania. So, and this was believed to be the site. This is not John and my idea. This is what was believed by the people who heard these readings at the time and talked to the University of Pennsylvania. So when they checked with the University of Pennsylvania, where were you in 1933 in the Yucatan? Well, there was only one place they were, and that was Piedras Negras. They did 8 years at Piedras Negras. And you can see, some people say, well, that's not the Yucatan. But the Yucatan, the border between Guatemala and Mexico was really still in question in 1933. So which was Yucatan, which was Guatemala at that time? Keisi probably thought of the whole area as the Yucatan. And you could argue that as the peninsula comes out, if you draw a straight line to cut off the peninsula, you go right through Piedras Negras. So it's still the Yucatan. I've talked about last year the Maya emblem glyph. We've always been excited because the Maya word for Piedras Negras, which is just black rocks, is Yokibi, which means entrance. But I found a reference in the last couple of months that where they have decided, now that they understand the hieroglyphs, that this Yokibi name is not just the Maya name, it's the mythological name for the site. The pre-Maya, the pre-classic name for the site, which means that it goes back much, much further. That's good. That's what we want to hear. And of course, what's odd about it is that really this site is not set up to be any kind of entrance to anything. If you look at how the geology is and how it's set up, there are lots of other Maya sites on the river. It never made sense for it to be called a great entrance, except that it has the largest cenote, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute, in all of Guatemala, and probably a cave system underneath. So what they think during the classic Maya time, the city itself was probably called Paw Stone. And that's why one of the most iconic altars there is and part of it was taken by Penn to the University of Pennsylvania Museum in 1932. One of the leg supports had a paw stone on the top of it, so they call it the Paw Stone altar. So in 2004, Greg and I made our way. Here I had spent all this time at the University of Pennsylvania in the archives studying this site, so I felt like mentally I had been there. I had seen all of these things and poured through the handwritten notes by Linton Satterthwaite, who was the primary archaeologist at Penn, and that he wrote as he was at Piedras Negras, trying to figure out what did he find in 1933, where were they in 1933. So in 2004, we decided to head there. Of course, I have to pat Iltar on the back. If they did take the records to Piedras Negras, they couldn't have picked a better place. It is really hard to get to. You can't get there by road. You can't even fly in. You have to go by the river. And it takes about 3 hours in these little boats because it's shallow in some places and there are rapids. And here you see Greg portaging across. The rapids are dangerous enough that they didn't want any of us in the boat. The two boat drivers went across, but they portaged with us in the beginning, looked over at the rapids to kind of get a feel for how it was doing today before they got in the boat and went across. So we picked them up on the other side. Beautiful waterfalls. When you get to Piedras Negras, you can't see it from the river. We're almost there. And you see I'm pointing the arrow to the place where the boat's going to park. And this is the sandbar where the boat parks. These are these two fresh, I love our white socks. We were told we had to be careful about bugs, and of course it's also time to get the rest of the pants on. But it was so exciting for me. I looked at pictures of myself to get ready for this presentation, and I thought, boy, I'm really happy. And it's hot as heck in this place. Why am I so happy? Because I've probably had a lifetime in the Maya era. So at this point, we're still fresh. It's still cool. We're by the river. But I wanted you to see what happens later. We become a little less fresh. And part of the reason is these were our 5-star accommodations. Greg and I shared this pup tent. I don't think we've ever slept that close together in our whole marriage. So all our equipment was in there. But that was our accommodations for 3 nights. Okay, but we got to go through the site, and another clue that Keisie says that a temple overshadowing the place where the records are hidden. Well, dadgummit, there's all kinds of temples all over this place. There's the South group, which they know are pre-classic, and they've never gotten down to the bottom levels of it. They know that it is older. On the far end, there's a huge Acropolis temple. It's the tallest area. It's beautiful. This is an artist's depiction of it, of how it probably looked during the Maya classic period. It's built over a huge cliff, could easily have caves underneath it. This is what it looks like today as they're trying to rebuild it for tourists. I can't imagine there'll be that many people that'll head out there, but it's also very dangerous right now. The drug runners are taking the Usumacinta River, and it's actually not recommended for Americans to go back. It was a little sketchy when we were there, but it's worse now. This is some of the artistry at Piedras Negras. It's one of the places where they found incredible hieroglyphs that had helped them to begin the deciphering process of the hieroglyphs. This is the famous mask on Temple K5, and it once had 6 of these masks. Well, this was important to me because the Penn expedition in 1933 stayed an extra 2 weeks because they found this mask. And about that time, they could only stay till July because the rains start coming and it gets muddy as all get out, and it's hard to even get out of there. But they were so excited about this mask that they stayed longer than they normally did. So that was a red flag.
And this is a picture of it when we were there, so it still exists. His eyes are getting a little bigger and his teeth are gone, but he's still there. And there were supposed to originally be jaguar masks. I'm sure it was really beautiful. Then it says the records are in some sort of chambers, which may be entered in 38. Keisi doesn't say 1938, but that's what we assumed when we read it. So, of course, I'm hunting through the records, and I look and I see, okay, where were they in 1938? And what did they find in 1938? Well, they were there from 1931 to 1939. And guess what happened in 1938? Nothing. They took the year off. They didn't go. I'm like, what? You know, the 1 year we're looking for 1933 too, but what is this? So at the time we wrote in the book, well, maybe 2038. Well, now John's got the pyramid information of the fifth race is going to possibly rise in 2038. Makes you wonder. Okay, so what kind of chambers might there be? Well, one of the most interesting things about this site is that there's a temple, 013, that's built in a cliff, and Brigham Young tunneled in it. We also know the Acropolis Temple is built on a cliff, so if there's a chamber, it'd be easy to place it around those two sites. We also know that there are 3 altars in front of 013. You see the Paw stone altar, which probably had a lot of human sacrifice during the classic Maya era. There's one of the only 2 circular table altars, and there's a whole bunch of little, what they call column altars. But the archaeologists are excited about 013 because it's it has a lot of hieroglyphic writing, had a lot of stelae. It had so many altars in front of it. It was, of course, built inside the side of a cliff, and it was the most ornate pyramid of any of them. And these are some of those cylinder altars nearby. They were just across. So a lot of sacred stuff happened in this place. And on one of this carvings nearby, there's a story. The hieroglyphs, now that they know how to begin to decipher them, it says there's a cave nearby. So Brigham Young got real excited, and they said, we're going to tunnel through 013. There must be a tomb in there somewhere. This is one of the panels that was found at 013 by the University of Pennsylvania, but not in 33. It was in 31. This is what's left of the tunnel that Brigham Young did. This was 2004. They did the tunneling probably in the late 90s, earlier in the 2000s. And of course they covered it back over. They never could get to the depth they needed to get to because the rubble kept coming down on them. They couldn't keep the workers safe. So they didn't get to the tomb. These are just some pictures. This is like a mosaic of pictures that I took to give you an idea. You see the top. This tells you how high this is and how much growth there is on it. It of course, doesn't look anything like the drawing anymore. But while we were there, one of the 2 rangers who had been going around the site ahead of us, thank God, with their machetes, watching for the fertilants, because I know I probably would have stepped right on the head of one. It'd be my luck. But they were, clearing the path for us. As we were standing in front of this, one of them goes over and he puts his hand in this opening that was left from the tunneling that Brigham Young had done, and he says, "Cool air, cool air." And of course, my first thought was, "Thank God, cool air, where?" Because we're dripping with sweat. We laughed that they had so many sweat baths at Piedras Negras, and we're thinking, why do they need a sweat bath? They've got the weather. So we go over and you put your hand in and there's cool air. Where's cool air coming from? Well, some kind of underground cavern. It has to relate to some of those subterranean cenotes or caves, the cave possibly that's talked about on the hieroglyphs. So there's a very tantalizing clue. That could be the chamber. This is a picture taken really close inside of it. And this is looking down from the edge of the largest cenote in Guatemala. So I'm standing on the edge. Here's a tree. I'm probably hanging on to one of the branches, and I've got the camera. And if you look up at the top, that's the other edge on the other side where the white ends. And so you kind of have to focus to get the depth. It has not been explored. The only person who's explored it was a Brigham Young University archaeologist who fell into it. He survived, but he didn't explore. They were just lucky to get him back out again. And no one has gone into it. So you have to wonder if it's part of some major subterranean system underneath the site. Be a great place for Iltar to put those records. Keecy also tells us that the records are near a sundial, that between a temple and the chambers, and where temples are being uncovered. Well, that gets a little more specific. So what's a sundial look like? Well, the first thing I think of is the sacrificial stone where you come in on the beach, but there's no temples near it, so had to throw that out. What else looks like a sundial? Well, there's this really unusual altar, Altar 1, that the University of Pennsylvania spent a lot of time looking at and tearing down, and so that they could get underneath to see if there was a cache of artifacts underneath it, and there was. Usually that's one of the things they do when they dedicate an altar. You see it's right in front of the big Acropolis, which is one of those that's over a cliff. You see O13 off to the side. K5 is the one with the big masks. So it seems like it could be what Keecy's clue of the sundial is all about. But one of the things that's really interesting about it is that they have now deciphered some of the hieroglyphs on Altar 1. And it tells a story that they call mythological about an event that happened in 4,600 BC. You know, again, that has to be a myth, but we know better. And they talk about a holy Pietrus Negris Lord who witnessed some kind of event back then. If you'll notice, his name was Turtle, and that's one of the unique things about Pietrus Negris. Their clan, in each of the big classic sites, had a clan name that usually was some kind of animal, like the snake or the jaguar. Well, this group claimed to be descendants of the Turtle clan, and they named their rulers the Turtles. Well, I'm thinking to myself, okay, Zamna came out of the turtle shell. Wonder if this is another clue. But on this hieroglyph, it says that the paddler gods, okay, we're back to the creation story on this altar, changed the hearthstones, the 3 stones. It happened at the edge of the sky, probably the ocean, at the first 3 stone place. Okay, wonder what that is. Well, I also came across, and I'm sure this is a synchronicity that was not an accident, some information from some of the new decipherments that they know now that the emblem glyph for caracol in Belize is a word that means 3 stone place. Remember, it was on the coast. It's one of the places that could possibly be Iltar's first temple, where he first put the records. But anyway, this turtle ruler witnessed it. It happened at the 5 flower place. Well, this 5 flower place, they don't know where it is. But they say that it shows up on other hieroglyphic stela in other places around the classic Maya era. And they consider it a mythological place. All right. Another strange thing at Pietrus Negris is they have rock art. And this is apparently an ancient place where very simple ceremonies were done to honor the cosmic turtle and the emergence of its Zamna. And you can see me standing down at the bottom to give you an idea how tall this is. But this is some sort of a sacred place, and it's not far from the South Group, which is one of the oldest areas. Okay, what about the Firestone clues, the emblem of the Firestone, which is supposed to be near the records? Well, something was found in 1933, carried to museums in Pennsylvania, Washington, and Chicago, Keecy says, and a pattern of what was carried there will reveal the facets of the Firestone. We know the Firestone is a 6-sided figure set as a crystal and was cylindrical. Some people believe that the column altars that they find in large numbers at Pietrus Negris, larger numbers than anywhere else, might be the emblem of the Firestone. But he does say they're stones. But some people believe, well, let me show you real quickly. This is what was found underneath altar 1. And of course, I'm looking for something that's an emblem of the Firestone. And the closest thing that I could find is a hematite disc. And I say it's the closest thing because in another clue, Keecy tells us, find it here, that the stones that were circular of the magnetized influence were the ones that were used as the Towie stone, as the spiritual use of the firestone, where they spoke to the angels. It was part of the earliest Atlantean activities. He said those could be found in the Yucatan. And we really do believe that those are probably what those mirrors were all about. You know, they show Itzamna with a mirror on his headdress, and he was considered the priest of divination. So he may still have had his ability to interact with the angels, and that's what they're trying to tell us in that mythology. Now, the Olmec had a circular magnetite disc that was very magnetic. Then when you get to the Maya, they become either hematite, and sometimes they become pyrite mosaics. So they become less and less magnetized, but they're still used as mirrors. And Penn did pick one up at Piedras Negras, and it is on display. So some people believe that that's the emblem of the Firestone. Okay, so to end the talk then, what have we learned here? What do the Keecy clues tell us about the Maya? Well, obviously it was a high civilization with multiple cultural components, and LIDAR seems to be definitely showing that. Much more complex, and it's much earlier than we previously understood, and El Mirador, San Bartolo, and the decipherment is taking us back further into Maya history. The older history is still being discovered in the caves, and we also know that Keecy has tells us that we have repeating cycles of this sons of Belial, sons of the law of one. And when I first heard that, my first inclination was to say, oh, I know who those sons of Belial are. It's those people over there. But then you start reading the readings, the people got life readings, and you find out that a lot of times over those 200,000 years in Atlantis, they incarnated, and sometimes they were law of one. And sometimes when they came back, they were sons of Belial. Or sometimes even in one lifetime, they switched from one to the other. So that makes me believe that there's some of both probably in all of us. It's our shadow side. It's not just us and them. That we all have some sons of Belial in us. We all have some law of one. But we want to magnify the law of one. And I think even in our own time, as polarized as we are at this particular time, we can get a lesson from this, that we have all been through this before. This is nothing new. We're one more time going through this karmic cycle. Let's see if we can get it right this time. So stay tuned. The truth about ancient history of the Americans is only going to get more interesting, and I can't wait to see what happens. Thank you.